Good morning. Well, as people can see, we're in a new location. So hopefully the sound stays the same, but if it's too much echo because of the larger space, viewers can let us know. But today we're gonna discuss the white supremacist social system, which also built upon our past preschool discussions of the Black social system. And we'll also about war and the case for China. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Dr. Anthony Montero to kind of begin our discussion on the white supremacist social system.
Well, thank you very, very much. And it's so beautiful to be here. And we cannot thank Madre Jesse Alejandro enough. He always promised us that when they finished the restoration here, we could come in and have free school here. And I think her vision is ours, that churches must become palaces for the people, especially for young people, and not close their doors to the people. And so we're here because of her vision, because of her generosity, and because of her kindness. And I think this space fits us well. We needed a little more space. But I'm going to try to walk us through the concept of social systems as a way of understanding societies, but also as a way of understanding the current crises. First of all, a crisis like the one that we are experiencing and that the world is experiencing is what we might call a world transforming crisis. A crisis whose resolution demands a fundamental transformation of the relationships between peoples and nations and civilizations. It is existential for the ruling elite of the United States and the other Western nations, because I think in the end, and I guess we're not the only ones to say this, but in the end, we're looking at the end of an empire. In a certain sense, we're fortunate to be witnesses to this. On the other side, there are many dangers, and as well, many demands upon those who would define themselves as revolutionary, which is another way of saying choose to position themselves in the vanguard of the people's movement for change. And by vanguard, we always mean the ideological, philosophical, and theoretical vanguard. It is not a performative project. It is not something that you choose to do because you want to be seen or heard for a few months. It is what is done because it must be done. And in a lot of ways, well, I would say in a fundamental way, the year of Baldwin is about that as well. But I'll come back to that, the year of Baldwin and the demands of theory and ideology. But what I was saying is every crisis of this magnitude requires new theory, but more than new theory, better theory. And I think the science conference, but other things that we have been doing, including the reading groups around the city, are part of this struggle for new and better theory. The science conference, which I've been looking at incessantly on YouTube, reviewing all of the speeches and comments, and I felt that it was a breakthrough, a paradigm changing event, but it must be built upon because we need more theory and we need better theory. And for that reason, I want to talk about ways of understanding societies in crises and systems in crisis. First of all, let me define social system. Well, before I define that, every moment of change, of profound change, brings forward new theory. When we talk about Marx and Engels and their followers, it was the crisis in European societies produced by the upsurge of the working class of Europe in the 1840s and the uprising of 1848. Marx and Engels had pretty much been academics without an anchorage. It was the working class uprising that gave a social, class, and political anchorage to the things that they were thinking about and debating with their colleagues. And Engels writes a very important essay where he talks about the component parts of Marxism, what he called the three component parts of Marxism. And the reason I want to present them because it says something about that period and something we must know about that period in comparison to this one. He said the three component parts was classical German philosophy, meaning Hegel and dialectics, British political economy, by which they were talking about essentially Adam Smith and his book Wealth of Nations, and French socialism. And by French socialism, he did not mean just socialist theories, but theories of a class conflict. So these three component parts made up the theoretical and ideological foundations of what became known as Marxism. And thus, they will produce, Marx will produce Das Kapital, which is a reworking in many fundamental ways of Adam Smith. Adam Smith writes a book, The Wealth of Nations. Where does wealth come from? And Marx says wealth is produced by the exploitation of labor, and he goes on to show it. In terms of logic and historical and social logic, it is dialectics, taken directly from Hegel, but as Marx and his followers said, inverting it, rather than making it history as the dialectic of ideas, it is history as the dialectics of class struggle, of social struggle. And finally, oh, by the way, and that dialectics, and this is straight from Hegel, that dialectics provides a unifying theory, if you will, of all science, of all material reality. And I think this is very important to understand. Dialectics at that time was a unifying theory. I think the question that we have is it still enough to unify science and physical and social science, but we'll get to that. And finally, the theory of socialism, which is they would separate utopian or anarchistic socialism from scientific socialism. Examples of anarchistic or utopian socialism would be like Noam Chomsky, you know, and no hate on his name, you know, but he's an anarchist, and he's an anarcho-syndicalist by definition, by his own definition of himself. Another such anarchist, you might see him on YouTube videos, is Richard Wolff, Marxist economist. And I'm not gonna say much. I mean, it's like Marxism 101. I mean, come on, dog. It's like, he read Das Kapital when he was 20, and he's repeating it over and over and over again. And you say, well, what is the solution? The workers take over the factories. What Marx and Engels said is that the workers must take state power, and that socialism must have a class anchorage in the sense of the whole class and not just in this or the other factory. So, in every respect, you would have to say that Marxism, in this first iteration, was a great advance in science. And it was almost the ways that we talk, a fusion, a synthesis, a bringing together of several areas of social and philosophical thought. And to use that framework as a way to investigate the world. In other words, he was not just doing economic analysis. It was economic analysis informed by Hegelian dialectics and the French theories of the class conflict. Okay? Kind of what we're doing. And a huge and important movement develops out of that period and the theories of Marx. Most significantly, the developments in Germany of the German Social Democratic Party. And every other Marxist party in the world, including the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, out of which Lenin comes, models itself in one or another way upon the German Social Democratic Party. Many revolutionaries come out of that party, including people like Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, but also it became a home for reformists, revisionists, and opportunists, which meant that from the 1880s, when this huge party, this influential party in German politics, this party, which in some ways could claim to be the inheritor of the First Reich, that is Bismarck, we can get more into that. But it had a claim on German society, rightfully so. But this claim on German society and its forward march would eventually take the German Social Democratic Party into opportunism and ultimately the support of the German capitalist class in World War I, which was the crime of crimes, because you were supporting your working class in a war led by your ruling class against other nations and their working classes. So while Marx had called for the unity of the European working classes across national boundaries, what they would have called internationalism, the German Social Democratic Party descended into nationalism. At that point, the socialist movement, again, which had been associated with social democracy, got to return to that, remind me if I forget, in 1991 in Gorbachev, because there's always the pressure for communists to go back to social democracy as a practical, realistic way of marketing socialist ideas to the working class. However, World War I splits the socialist movement in Europe. And by Europe, I'm including Great Britain at this time. And this division is existential whether the socialist movement could go forward after this crisis. Would the split be so profound that socialism could never be restored or reunited? The socialist movement could never be reunited? Or would something new come out of this crisis? And as it turned out, something new did come out of it, and it was Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who were a wing of the social democratic movement in Russia, but a wing that ultimately had its own voice, its own program, its own theory, and so on. World War I was a civilizational crisis for Europe, although it was not articulated as such, but that's what it was. Not only could there be a socialist movement, but would European civilization collapse? Lenin's theory, which saves Marxism, and hence what gives Leninism its moral and political authority, it saves Marxism from opportunism, which was a great achievement in and of itself. But Lenin had to do and say things that Marx and Engels and certainly the German Social Democrats would never say. That the first break with capitalism would not be in an advanced nation. It would break, since it had become a world system, it would break at its weakest link, or one of its weakest links. And that weak link at this time, 1914 through 1917, the weak link was Russia. But Russia was not European. Right. It was Euro-Asiatic. So the authority of Leninism, and hence the joining of Leninism to Marxism, producing what we came to call Marxism-Leninism, was validated by the fact that this existential crisis in Europe manifested itself most deeply in Russia, leading to the collapse of the old system, the old regime, and the Bolsheviks literally walking in and taking power, seizing the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, I think it was called by that time, after almost 9 months of political convulsions within Russia, from February 1917 to October. In the midst of a war, the society is politically convulsing. Lenin says not only should the Bolsheviks seize power, but the Bolsheviks could seize power. That was bold and courageous, believe me. And so for the Marxist or revolutionary movement to go forward, it had to acknowledge a significant shift in the theory of Marxism. So remember, Engels said 3 component parts: French socialism, British political economy, and classical German philosophy. Now, a new theory that we call Leninism, which I don't know if Lenin would talk about 3 component parts, but he assumes what Marx and Engels had discovered, but then deploys it in a struggle to defend science from positivism, to defend political economy from narrow nationalist concerns, and to see a world system dominated by banking and finance capital, and to see a world movement rather than national movements. a world movement. And hence, while I don't know that he said it like I am saying it, bringing into the center of revolutionary change the anti-colonial struggle. And that is why, for example, all of these leaders of anti-colonial struggles, from Ho Chi Minh to Sun Yat-sen to all of the early leaders of the Communist Party of China, Juda, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, all of them find their way to the Soviet Union. All of the leaders of the most militant working class movements in the United States, like Big Bill Haywood, Mother Bloor, Mother Jones, but then all of these leaders of the Black movement, the African Blood Brotherhood, ultimately all of these African Americans who joined the Communist Party, who agreed that the Russian Revolution and the theory of the Russian Revolution had world implications. In other words, Lenin's theory, or Marxism, Leninism, could illuminate the path of the class struggle throughout the world, okay, including the anti-colonial struggle. Everybody was almost obligated, if you were revolutionary, to study this. Makes all the sense in the world. This is the first break in the history of capitalism, the first revolutionary break with capitalism itself. Okay? And it comes unexpectedly in an unexpected place. You might say law and chance. Okay. A world movement of communist parties, no longer calling themselves social democrats, those who broke, followed the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks ultimately named the party that took power the Communist Party of Russia, and ultimately the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So a world movement of parties naming themselves communist parties, not everywhere, but in most places. For example, in Vietnam, it was not called the Communist Party, it was called the Vietnamese Workers' Party. In Korea, the Workers' Party of Korea, I think they called it then, pardon me. But they are coming out of the anti-colonial struggles. But the world communist movement is a movement of political parties and those associated with them who defend the Russian Revolution. That is how it is initially formed. And in defending the October Revolution, they are ipso facto pointing the path to class conflict and the victory of the working class in each country. And, I haven't been a part of that. I joined the Communist Party because, not so much because of its great impact upon the American scene, but because it is linked to a world movement that includes the African independence movements, the Asian independence movement, the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnam resistance. I joined a world movement and not just a national party. And of course, the Communist Party of the United States, its authority and authenticity emerges from its being linked at all costs to this world movement. After World War II, of course, and if the October Revolution did not bring great authority morally and politically to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, certainly the defeat of Nazism did. A huge victory in the name of humanity and of human civilization. And it is from that that the national liberation movements and the revolutionary forces in capitalist countries, as well as uh, the Soviet Communist Party, can see themselves in a common struggle with a common vision. And in fact, I know at the time that I was active in the Communist Party, we did not see any division between ourselves here and the communists in other places, maybe the Italians, maybe the French, because they always will, they got to have it their way. But with the Soviet Union, none. With the National Liberation Forces, be they in Guinea-Bissau or Ghana or wherever on the African continent, nor with the North Koreans or wherever, the Vietnamese. We saw no difference, no basis for criticism, and that more than anything, we stood for building this worldwide unity. A great deal was achieved. The defeat of Nazism, 27 million Soviet citizens are killed. In the process, it is the Soviet Union that defeats, not Hitler. By the way, almost 3/4 of all of the German military forces were on the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. Hitler's idea was to bring the Soviet Union down and thus open the path to Asia through the Soviet Union. In fact, if you look at the Soviet Union, it is not only the North Asian, which is more towards Korea and China, but also South Asia and the various peoples and civilizations of that area, such as Tajiks, Uzbeks, uh, who else? Kazakhs, who are part of that whole Central Asian landmass that includes Iran, Pakistan. If you notice, they all have the ending Stan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, um, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the stands, that belt of um, Central Asian civilizations and linguistic groups. Uh, so all of this is connected. As long as the Soviet Union plays this vital and central role, it all holds together. The anti-imperialist movement intersects with the peace movement. And peace increasingly is taken out of the realm of pacifism, bourgeois pacifism and liberalism, to the revolutionary objective of anti-imperialism. And that's peace and justice, peace and freedom, peace and anti-colonialism, all are connected. And that's the way we function. However, be it through exhaustion, because the Soviet Union carried tremendous weight. It's just like, if you know somebody has all of the answers, why should I think? Because they know, I just ask them. And I would say in some ways we became intellectually lazy. Many of us did. We could read a Soviet journal, a Soviet book, a Soviet commentary. I had a shortwave radio, so I listened to Radio Moscow, and they knew. It was like Big Brother knows best. And there was not enough development of theory. Certainly not in the United States. That's why I think Winston is this great communist, because he dared to rethink communist theory in light of the Black freedom struggle. He was not understood, as I've said so many times, then or now. But at any rate, the Soviet Union seemed, the leadership here, we're talking about the leadership, seemed to have become exhausted and could not reproduce a leadership that was theoretically or ideologically capable of being in the vanguard, as it were, of a world movement for peace, socialism and justice, anti-colonialism, and so on. This produces, and I've said this before, a leadership, or at least part of the leadership, that was represented by Mikhail Gorbachev, who wanted to make a strategic compromise with Western imperialism. In other words, throw in the towel, give up the struggle, and say, we lost, you won, and communism has failed. This is Gorbachev, and this is Francis Fukuyama, by the way. And a better theory is social democracy. So, we're back to that again. It is more practical. It accounts for the world situation. Revolution is not on the horizon, etc. A big part of the exhaustion of the Soviet Union, of course, in the post-World War II period, is the Chinese leadership under Mao Zedong, which unnecessarily divided the world movement. I do not believe that the differences were so great that China had to come forward with a different theory, which says that the world is divided into three. There's Western imperialism and there's social imperialism. The social imperialism was the Soviet Union. And then there is the darker world, the anti-colonial forces. They went around the world attempting to divide up what took many years to build up. But at any rate, the outcome was exhaustion of the Soviet Union, of its party, of its capacity to theoretically address the new moment in technology, in national liberation. We're now at the stage of neocolonialism, not old colonialism, and on and on. And their economies seem to have become stuck in dogmatic ideas. So Gorbachev and those throw in the towel. I have said for some time, and I still think this is the case, that Western intelligence had penetrated to the very top of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Nobody ever thought that was possible. Therefore, when Gorbachev starts coming forward with this nonsense and this betrayal, a lot of people that I knew in the Communist Party saw it as a calculated move to disarm Europe, to demilitarize Europe, and that the greater interest of peace is being pursued. Well, we now know the very opposite was the case. The wars in the Middle East, the color revolutions throughout Eastern Europe, the movement of NATO to the east, eventuating in the war that we're now going through in the Ukraine. Gorbachev and his people had no guarantees from the West that if we gave up communism, you would give up militarism, or imperialism for that matter. Gorbachev abandoned everybody, including the democratic and revolutionary forces in Afghanistan. Soviet troops in Afghanistan was not an invasion. It was the result of a mutual defense pact. The abandonment of Cuba, I will never forget Gorbachev going there, literally smiling in Fidel Castro's face, saying, "Now I'm cutting you off." I mean, a gangster move if there ever was one. Never forget him, that's why you can pick up a certain contempt that I have for him. It's like we white now, and that's what it was. And this is where the question of civilization comes into play, because the Soviet Union is not, was not, and will never be European. At best, it is Eurasian, but more than that, it is Asian. In some ways, you go to the Soviet Union, they look something like what's around this table. But this crisis then requires new theory of what is the revolutionary path ahead. And by revolution, let me say this. We ain't talking about no reckless running up and down the street, acting like you know something you don't know, and wild statements and slogans, and I'm going to take the police down. That's not what we're talking about. Anybody that acts like that is usually an agent provocateur, or an agent of an agent provocateur, a tool of an agent provocateur. And usually people who identify revolution with that are people who trivialize theory and trivialize the capacity of the people. Now, a new theory is necessary. And so a way of thinking about modern societies and new societies coming into existence is necessary. If you recall, one of the key component parts of Marxism is political economy, British political economy. We've talked about this. The Brits were not that good at philosophy, and they aren't. But what they were good at is economic theory. The Brits and sometimes the Austrians, but the Brits are the major players. But economic theory is also grounded in the British philosophy of the individual. Now, of course, let me not go through too much detail. Of course, this discovery begins in continental Europe. You could probably say Descartes, but then it becomes the groundwork of British philosophy and economic theorizing. This economic theorizing as a way to explain and understand societies carries with it profound weaknesses and predispositions that take us away from the goals that we say we are fighting for. Okay? This is nowhere more apparent than in the United States. An economic model for explaining society and the revolutionizing of society that is based in English philosophy, I'm saying, the high point being John Locke, or British economic theorizing, the high point being Adam Smith, is not sufficient to explain the American situation. In fact, in Marxism, the key category is what we call a mode of production. To understand society, you must understand the economic mode of production and reproduction of that society. Okay? That everything else is derivative of that. That's why, in a lot of ways, Marxism is very appealing to certain people because it's a simplistic understanding of society. If you understand the mode of production, you can understand the philosophy, you can understand the religion, you can understand the culture, you can understand the people. Okay? However, we now know that is not the case. We could have known it all along. There were attempts to kind of take Marxism in a different direction, but still very Eurocentric. For instance, the Frankfurt School, who combined Marxism with psychoanalysis. They said the crisis of Europe is the crisis of European man, and the crisis of European man can be explained by understanding psychoanalytically the European man. Okay? So Marxism, which they would see as a theory of history, must be combined with psychoanalysis, which is a theory of the interior life. But that was not adequate. Again, it remains pretty much Eurocentric, while Leninism was more Asia. It could not account for the anti-colonial movements, etc. Even though people like Frantz Fanon would attempt to fill in the gaps, the missing parts of this kind of theorizing. Jean-Paul Sartre would attempt to reframe Marxism philosophically in a book, Critique of Dialectical Reasoning. But it all remained, in my opinion, academic. However, there was a body of knowledge, a body of theorizing taking place at the same time. Of course, it is Du Bois, and it is what comes out of his analysis of America, Black people, and the struggle for democracy, underlining democracy, and as a consequence, the necessity to redefine the human away from the individual to the complete human. And thus, when Du Bois writes souls of Black folk, he's not talking about soul music or soul food. I try to tell people that. He's talking about the spirit, that which establishes the Black person as not just an equal individual, but an equal human being with great and untapped human potential in spite of enslavement. He'll work this in many different ways, of course, finally in Black Reconstruction, which is, I think, not only his magnum opus, but fundamental to the understanding of the class and democratic struggles in the United States. But then from Du Bois's work, I want to talk.
No.
From Du Bois's work, you get a body of sociology by Black people, historically Black colleges and universities, places which were looked down upon by the white academy. I mean, as they are today, but even more so then. When Du Bois, the great Du Bois, whose dissertation is the first book in the Harvard Historical Series, just a tremendous figure. And certainly by the 1930s was a world figure, with with all of the leaders of the anti-colonial struggles of that time. He was so profound that Kwame Nkrumah called Du Bois the father of Pan-Africanism,
Mhm.
which is another way, I think this is often missed. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, the nation of Ghana, calling Du Bois the father of Pan-Africanism, was saying that Du Bois was the father of the modern African independence movement. And he was. And he was. So he is this great figure who never really teaches or has an appointment at a white university.
Mhm.
Um, at Atlanta University, he's carrying out these detailed sociological studies of the Black South. You know, and it's 2 volumes of what are called the Atlanta University Studies.
Right.
Every year, he would gather Black scholars to talk about a area of Black life.
Mhm.
1 year, Black education; the next year, Black business; another year, Black agriculture, you know. And every 10 years, they would do it, and then they would repeat 10 years hence the same studies to see what progress had made, what had changed, and so on. Well, he had a 100-year plan that this would go on for 100 years. I think they drove him out of Atlanta before he could get too far in that project. But this is a great initiative in sociology. So the spirit of sociological study, and here I want to emphasize sociology, not economics. Economics became the quote science of sciences in the white academy. Economics was viewed as being closer to natural sciences and a harder science, as they would call it then, than, for example, sociology or psychology or anthropology. These were considered less empirically robust. Um, just one more thing I want to say. However, the spirit of Du Bois is all over the Black Academy. So you get, for example, Horace Mann Bond, by the way, the father of Julian Bond and the first Black president of Lincoln University, who writes a book, I think published in the 1930s or early 1940s, entitled Education in Alabama, subtitle, A Study in Cotton and Steel. Already the title kind of announces how advanced the work is and the thinking that produces the work. But then E. Franklin Frazier produces this work, The Negro Family in U.S. History, which we've talked about. But what makes this work special is that it is a study of a social system. It is this sociological approach that I am suggesting would produce from us and others the kind of knowledge that is necessary to advance a revolutionary struggle, a revolutionary project in the United States. So rather than the economic paradigm of mode of production, or some would also frame it as a socioeconomic system, I am suggesting a sociological framing as a system, a social system. Now, what is a social system? Well, first of all, I would say what gives this approach great strength is that it does not just see one part of the social system as generative of the social system itself, but it sees parts and wholes interacting in all kinds of specific and unique ways that are the object of study. If one wishes to understand, let us say, the crisis of this time, of the American system, we are not merely talking about a crisis of the mode of production. We are talking about a crisis, and we call it existential because it is comprehensive. It is total. It affects every part of the social system. Now, when we say the parts of the social system, well, it is the economy, it is the political system, it is the system of ideas, it is the system of knowledge, it is the university system, it is the religious system, it is the cultural systems, it is the legal systems, and how these systems produce human groups, human behavior, visions of the future, human art, music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you have to see a system which is not overdetermined by one part of the system, but that is determined by the system itself and the interaction of its parts. Now, I think that kind of makes sense. I think the argument for sociology is not a difficult one to make, tell you the truth. I think the argument for pure economic analysis is a very difficult argument to make. And people who make it cannot go forward. I mean, and because I follow YouTube discussions, I see that they can't go forward. I see it in Richard Wolff. I see it in some others that we are friends with. They just can't go anywhere. You know, they always have to go back to something in the past. And their whole project becomes to reclaim something. But in reclaiming, they have no way of going forward. You know, now, but a system in general is, in a sociological sense, is what we have described. In sociology, we have systems analysis. Well, you get it in other fields, in information science. There are some economic theories or schools that talk about systemic analysis. But once you go to a systemic and a holistic systemic analysis, when you talk about crises, you're talking about something very different. You're thinking very differently. You are seeing a all-encompassing systemic crisis, and hence existential. Now, just a small footnote. There were theorists in the 70s who came forward with the idea of a world systems analysis. It's kind of out of Lenin's imperialism and a world system, and that's all good. But it was more language than substantive analysis. And it was the world viewed from the standpoint of the major capitalist countries, the US in particular. Because they did, I mean, if they talk about a world system, they talk about a world economic system. They're not talking about a world system because they don't know enough about the world. For example, India, it is a part of a world system. But if you don't know the Indian social system, how do you fit it into a world system? So at the end of the day, even that world systems analysis is an economic analysis. It defaults to economics. Okay. Now, so we kind of understand what we mean by a social system. I just want to say a few things. In such an analysis, you're dealing with macro, the overall, the largest category of analysis. Okay, we say that is macro. But then there is mid-level analysis, whatever that means, and I'm not certain. You know, the researcher would have to say which he is talking about. But then there's the micro level. And the micro could mean anything from the individual to networks, small groups, churches, denominations, etc. And, you know, in sociology, each level carries its own logic, its own possibilities, but each can be understood. But in crisis, each should and can be understood from the standpoint of a comprehensive crisis. How does a general or comprehensive crisis of the social system manifest itself in white mainline church denominations splitting and falling apart?
Right.
You see what I'm saying? How does it manifest, for example, in behaviors such as murder
Right.
in Philadelphia? And that's a complex one to understand, because when we get to the micro level, we're talking about small groups, we're talking what influences, the spiritual, ideological influences, the age factor, the hopelessness factor. But you can see that researchers have, well, a job to do and a project to carry out. And it would, I mean, really, if this is what they were doing in universities, everybody would be rushing to a sociology department in his or her neighborhood, you know. But anyway, but then a white supremacist social system, a social system that is not just this system as I have described it, but that exists in whole or in part to reproduce white supremacy in its institutions, in its ideology, in its identity. This is Baldwin, of course, in its politics, its economic life. So if you say white supremacist social system, well, we're not just looking at economics as a set of rational decisions by individuals and corporations, as you know. I think those who study economics would know what I'm talking about, this fraud, as it were. But you're talking about now all of these systems mediated through white supremacy as ideology, as purpose, as institutions, etc. A white supremacist social system. So now you say, but so a person would argue, well, isn't that inadequate? Because you have not talked about, or you have not adequately spoken about, the reproduction of material life, food, shelter, clothing, you know, the basics of life. Well, I don't know that that's true. The only thing is, what I would argue, we're not saying that is the sine qua non, the beginning and end of the question. Indeed, that is generative, that is important, but it is not the final word, because even that is mediated. In other words, Crystal studied economics, very boring, you know, where they, you know, economics got so, and so we're going to be like physics, that everything was reduced to mathematics, uh, really calculus, So if you could do calculus well, you could be a great economist. And that's a joke that should force all of us to fall on the floor holding our sides and laughter. In other words, if I was a good student in calculus in high school, all I have to do is go to the university, go to Wharton School of Economics, and I'm ipso facto, I'm a good economist because I can solve equations and I can show you. And this is the big thing. This is one of the great failures of economics and a lot of social theorizing. The point of equilibrium is the optimum point in society. Chris, you know where I'm coming from. Everything must show, all theory, I should say, must demonstrate how to arrive at the point of equilibrium, which is the rational center. It is the optimum point where, in certain ways, supply and demand meet at an optimum place, and so on. Much of it, anytime, and this is with string theory and anything else, any science that becomes overly reliant upon mathematics is already announcing its end. That is the last refuge of the coward, of the person who has nothing creative to say. And so all of these geeks, and with AI, they're going to go buck wild crazy. But let me go a little quick.
No, take your time.
There is no mediation. By mediation, what we mean is that a thing is not in existence in and of itself. It exists in relationship to other things that mediate it, which it mediates. So there are multiple mediations. It's a way of talking about multiple dialectical interactions. You know what I'm saying? So then if we, let's say, define for the sake of investigation a system as a white supremacist social system, a person would say, I can prove that it's not a white supremacist social system.
Right.
I heard this cat, Douglas Murray, a dude from England. Y'all remember the debate, Baldwin and Buckley?
Mm-hmm.
Remember how Baldwin spanked that behind so badly that Buckley ultimately said, well, I'm gonna tell you, told Baldwin, if you don't like it, we know how to handle you. You know, which was like a veiled threat that we can kill you if we want to. But so every generation produces its imitation of William F. Buckley.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Preferably from England, because Buckley had kind of an English accent. So that's culturally valuable. See, if you can talk with a British accent, well, you must be intelligent. You have a British accent. Well, anyway, it's a joke. So they got this cat, Douglas Murray, relatively young, about 50-something years old, By the way, just so if you guys didn't know, in this area of information and imaging, you have to look the part. You understand? So he looks the part, obviously good shape, I guess. uh, I guess he thinks he's cute. But so I'm listening to this cat. I said, okay, you William F. Buckley for the current time. And his analysis is that how can you make a claim that racism exists? racism doesn't exist. If you can't get ahead in this system, the capitalist system, which is defined by producing opportunity. Now, that's a hell of an assumption they all make, by the way, in economic theorizing. If you can't get ahead, it's because you are culturally pathological. So, homeboy, you're back to the 1960s, Buckley, Nathan Glazer, that whole can of garbage, and you're not even creative. You see what I'm saying? But I say that to say the ruling class has very few options in this ideological struggle to deny with the claim that I am making. That first of all, to understand a system, you must understand the system in its totality as a whole, as difficult as that is, and recognizing that at any one time there's a gang of stuff you will not know, and hopefully there'll be other people looking at other parts, and you know that a general theory of a system will be the result of research and investigations in many areas, you know, and no one person, no one group, no one anything can get it all at one time. However, situating the analysis in a study of a system and given American history to see the system as white supremacist systemically is crucial, inevitable, to make sense of the parts and of the system itself. I think that makes so much sense. I think anything else doesn't make a bit of sense given American history. Well, of course, that is Du Bois. But in so doing, Du Bois also situates sociology as a study of the human capacity, not of individual rational choice, of human capacity, and hence Baldwin continues that. But that is a different kind of sociology. That is sociology that is not hesitant.
Okay.
And what Du Bois was saying, I just like to reinterpret that essay.
Yeah.
What he was saying is that the positivist move in sociology was a way of shielding sociology from a study of the human.
Right.
Positivist social science, being in economics, sociology, or any other area, political science, positivism is a default to the rational individual. It is a form of metaphysics, not in the, let's say, Hegelian sense. It's a different, because it is a metaphysic based upon unsubstantiated assumptions about the human being, which defaults him or her or reduces him and her to a rational individual whose capacity is determined by the choices, the rational choices they make. Sociology hesitant cannot deal with the human being, and hence not the moral choice. We talk, but we'll come back to that. A white supremacist social system that even if you change the economy, even if, let us say, in the vision, imaginary of the Marxist activists, even if the working class takes power, that does not mean that the system will be transformed. A socialist economy does not mean a revolutionized society. Okay? It doesn't. And you can't, except if you want to make an imaginative leap, go from an economic transformation to a social revolutionary condition. You just can't do it. I don't care how much you talk, how many quotes you want to memorize from Das Kapital. I've memorized a lot of them myself.
Prove
So
it.
hey, look, and I memorized, and I forgot a lot of them. I know the performance because I performed it. You know what I'm saying? I didn't think I was performing but I did that memorization thing. I know what they're doing. They me a generation ago. And I'm trying to say, hold off, dog, talk to me. I've been there, did that.
Right.
But I can't get through to you because you think you know too much. But that's all right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. But anyway, there is no way to argue from an economic change, which increasingly in this world means a social democratic program. There's no way from that to a disentangling demolition of the white supremacist social system. You can have a socialist economy and a white supremacist social system coexisting at the same time.
Can you say that again? Yeah. Yes.
You can have a socialist economy and a white supremacist social system existing at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You can even do away with the billionaire class and not fundamentally alter the social system. Part of the problem is in the separation of the moral imperative from the revolutionary imperative, or defining the moral imperative as the revolutionary imperative. If the moral imperative is to feed the hungry, house the homeless, clothe the naked, get the imprisoned out of prison, and all of those things, all of that social justice. Well, to achieve that means an undoing of the white supremacist social system. Because look at how it works out. If it's not a white supremacist social system, why does the average white family in the United States average? And I'm not hating on white families. $140,000, $160,000 a year. Average black family, $75,000 a year. Why is it that although AIDS has pretty much been overcome, you go to Southeast Washington, the black area, it's on the rise? Why disproportionately have black people died from COVID? Why are black people disproportionately in the penitentiary? Not just a few percentage points more, 200% higher, 300% higher. You know, why is the measure of racial oppression what the numbers show for black folk? In other words, if you talk about Latinos as racially oppressed, well, they're racially oppressed because they're so close to black people. You see what I'm saying? Black people are the measure of racial oppression, okay? And anything you look at, wages, homelessness, go around Philadelphia, you know? Good people, homeless. I was just talking to a couple brothers on my way down here, waiting for the bus. 8:30 in the morning, they drinking vodka. You know, they old head. I said, how you know I'm your old head? You might be my old head, but it's that good people broken on the wheel of life. Okay. All of the evidence suggested that in this social systemic understanding, that the social system is a white supremacist system, that if it doesn't reproduce anything else, it reproduces oppression and inequality based upon race, that race is a marker for how the system treats you in every respect, from the micro to the macro. You want to know if it's racist? Become Black for 2 days and see how you then become a Black man. It's like rough out here. You know, you have to measure every step you take, every body movement that you make, you know, and you learn it from infancy. That you just can't do what other people do. You just can't go where other people go. The system reacts and responds to you systemically and individually differently. Okay? That is a measure of a systemic reality. It's not just because like you said, most Black people don't live around white people. Most Black people don't even talk to white people because we ain't in the same spaces. You know? But every Black person knows that there is a systemic response to us. That in fact, if you do go into, quote, white spaces, you will be treated differently. Even if in those white spaces, Black people are running it on behalf of white people. And thus, you can take like what are called civil rights leaders today, like an Al Sharpton. Right. He can protest all he wants. It means nothing as long as he is an apologist for white supremacist social system. And I'm introducing another. And its strategic agents. You see? Okay, now I just want to compare 2 other systems. The Black social system, the Afro-American, and we could put more, the African-American or Black freedom social system. The purpose, the raison d'etre, the organizing principles of Black life are the opposite of those that define and animate the white supremacist social system. Although there is significant overlap, some would say that the Black social system exists within the white supremacist social system as a part of it. I would argue that it is both and, it is part of and separate from, and therefore represents the fundamental alternative to the white supremacist social system. I think reading Baldwin through this framework makes him more cogent and helps us to understand and explain to others the revolutionary essence of his thinking. Now, what is the revolutionary imperative? Right. It is pretty much as has been defined by, let us say, Du Bois, Baldwin, of course, Winston King. I mean, it's kind of common in the Black life work. Black movements and Black people, without the language, understand that they face systemic obstacles to freedom. Without the language, it is implicit in the movements and lives of Black people that we are up against an entire system. That's why, take for example, anti-whiteness. Most Black people are not anti-white individuals. Right. They're very happy to find white people who agree with them, who appreciate their music, who, the whole nine. But that does not mean that they don't understand that there are larger forces determining the poor white, the working class white, and the Blacks. So I know Du Bois used the framing of a nation within a nation, a world within a world. I would say yes, but a world that is an alternative to a world.
Right.
A people whose very existence, as Baldwin talked about, surviving the last white nation, our survival is dependent and our advancement is dependent upon the strength of the African American freedom social system. And in that sense, the Black social system becomes that model of how to struggle, of how to resist. Now, does the Black social system exist for itself or in itself? It exists for democracy. That's what Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk says, that Black religion is organized around one principle, freedom. You listen to the sorrow songs. Why are they always talking about freedom? Why, if you come to a Black church, they say, well, y'all being too political. You say, well, why are we being too, all y'all want to talk about is freedom. Well, what else is there to talk about if you're Black? You know what I'm saying? I mean, we can't go to a Catholic church. It's hard for us to go there and, or church where they read everything from a book, because the essence is not freedom. The Black social system grew out of the struggle against slavery. And this is why Winston is so prescient and misunderstood when he writes from the anti-slavery to the anti-monopoly struggle. But he starts with the anti-slavery struggle. And that the anti-monopoly struggle must embrace principles, tactics, modes of struggle of the anti-slavery struggle, in particular Frederick Douglass, he would say. Okay, I won't say any more about that, but I think you get the picture. We could almost diagram it if we wanted to, and it'd be worthwhile doing. But the other and the final system that I like to just talk about is the Chinese social system. And here I learned from Kathy and Emily, and hopefully I can't wait for Alice to get back. And of course, from Michelle and Crystal. And I learned by just listening in your narratives, which are very, very valuable. Very, very valuable. And I think Xi Jinping, as this special leader in modern Chinese history, which goes back, I trace modern Chinese history back to the 1840s, and the Opium Wars, and what's it, the Zhang, what was the uprising? The Taiping Rebellion? No, not the Taiping, the uprising in the 1850. The Boxer? No, not the Boxers. Taiping Rebellion? I think it's the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted 20 years, and several million people were killed. It was a peasant uprising. But from that period up to now, which I consider modern China, a period of humiliation, 100 years of humiliation, up to this period of the advanced reconstruction of China. And we are at the advanced stage. That's what I learned from you, Kathy. What Xi Jinping and that leadership are in every way saying is that to restore China is to restore China and not just the economy of China. That a new social system is being developed, a new civilization, if you will. By the way, I should have said this, I forgot, that often the social systems analysis could be called a civilization analysis. I prefer the sociological framing, but it is in this large sense civilization. But for China and for the Xi Jinping leadership and this idea that Xi Jinping thought is now part of the political canon of Chinese thought is very important to me. First of all, the canon, which I think we should study more, because the canon would be more than Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping, and then Xi Jinping. The canon is a large body of thought where the political leader of the society is the representative of that canon. And it is because he represents the dominant or hegemonic canon that he is the leader. And not leader in the sense of some 1984 George Orwell fantasy. Leader as emerging from the system itself. And this is what I think we see in China in this advance movement, now having reached a stage, and perhaps the Xi Jinping leadership 2012 represented the end of a previous period and the start of a new. And what is being constructed is a new system, a new civilization. And in that sense, it becomes a model of the new and of the possible. My last point, all of this occurs, again, within a period of political and civilizational realignment. We are lucky to be witnesses to the decline of the last great empire. I put a lot of respect, no, not a lot, I put some respect on Francis Fukuyama in the sense that he understood beginnings and ends. You know, you'd agree. He understood that something had ended. But he did not understand the beginning of something new. He saw an end of something and said it was the end of history. But it was the end of a period in history and the beginning of a new period in history. We are now seeing the crystallization of the new. And this, well, I'll kind of stop there. I don't have anything else to say.
Okay.
I talked too long.
No.
I have one comment, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I learned this from previous lessons from the previous classes that the Enlightenment, the human accomplishment, had revolutions in scientific theory, including Marx, who studied the development of an economic system, but also Darwin and Freud, who studied the development of evolution, the development of species, and Freud, who studied the development of the psychology of the human being. So I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that those advances were from studying things in their development rather than studying things in their static moment. And it seems to be different from the British positivists, because when you go to the British Museum, Natural History Museum, what they did was they tried to catalog everything. They tried to catalog every artifact, bring it all back to Britain, catalog it, and then we'll understand it. It seems to me that's what is happening in particle physics, where we'll try to categorize every particle, and then we'll have a unified. We'll understand a unified theory, but it seems that we understand, it makes no sense unless you're a particle physicist. Anyway, they haven't gotten anywhere. And then the other comment I wanted to make about the Enlightenment, which was the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, the American Revolutions as products of the Enlightenment, as humans striving toward freedom, and how so many people on the left today categorize those revolutions as failures. But it seems to me that they just want to, give those revolutions back. Oh, they were failures. They meant nothing, rather than seeing revolution as a developmentary process, rather than seeing those. Yeah, so that's all I want to say is that some people on the left want to get back the French Revolution rather than seeing it as an accomplishment.
If I could just say something, I very much agree with you. And the study of the Enlightenment is a study that has to be done because it is a part of a great revolution. The ideological part, philosophical, scientific part of a revolution that included political revolutions, as you mentioned, the French. You could even say the English Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, and then sets the groundwork for the Russian Revolution. Because don't think the Bolsheviks and others in Europe did not see the possibility of revolution when they look back to the French Revolution, which, by the way, was not that far from when they were living and thinking. But then, and this is a question, I know I say a lot of things about this, and I don't know that I'm accurate. There can be any number of counter arguments. But Europe and European civilization has perhaps exhausted itself. But even the great achievements of the European Enlightenment to go forward, it will not be in the hands of Europeans. And so this is where this question of the civilization crisis. Can Europe recover as a civilization? Right now, the West is in a standstill, a hold off, and they're threatening everybody irrationally that if you cross over and try to undermine the values upon which our civilization is built, we will go to war against you. I think that is a sign of a civilization that has no way forward. I think most Western men and women who identify themselves as Western men and women, or as white people, by the way, see much hope in Western civilization. They said, well, it happened, now what do we do with it? And there are people who say, well, it happened, and we know what to do with it. I think in some ways the Chinese are saying that. I think in very important ways, the North Koreans, I think Putin in a certain way has now concluded that Europe is exhausted and failing, and we have to look as Russians to that other pillar of our civilization, which is Asia.
Well, it's hard to know where to even begin because actually, for me, the clarifying, I was going to actually ask you the question, which you clarified, which is the difference between a social system versus civilizational analysis. Yes. Because actually, when you were talking, especially when you began by talking about Leninism, like where Lenin comes in, it made me think a lot about Du Bois's The World in Africa. Because actually, the whole point of The World in Africa starts with Du Bois saying, I think he wrote it after World War I, right? World War II. He was like, both the world wars are not, the way to analyze why the world wars happen is not as simple as, he basically saying, I'm actually not sure he's responding to completely, but he's saying that it's a civilizational crisis.
Mhm.
And in some ways, from our standpoint, in some ways, I feel like Du Bois is talking in terms of what would actually in a more crystallized sense, become a white social system, right? Because the white social system is not just within America. Actually, in some ways, the white social system has roots in what we would call European civilization or Western civilization, which is also why for us it's more accurate to say that there's such thing as a white civilization because of the way it's not simply about geography or doesn't have roots in just one area of the world anymore, but instead is almost a self-identified identity of like whatever white connotates, like certain standards, like not just economic. But the reason why I thought it was important, like I thought of Du Bois, was because what you were saying, Doc, about even tracing Lenin, like that, going back to Marxism as having those three components.
Yes.
But then with Leninism saving Marxism, it's not really about those three components anymore. And the anchorage isn't really class, but
Well, I
actually,
didn't say that. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Forgive me.
well, maybe
sorry.
I'm wrong
No,
because
I'm sorry. I didn't mean
the
to.
reason why the Leninism thing isn't important is, well, okay, actually you clarify whether Leninism still has an anchorage in class, because I was really,
It's class plus.
yeah.
And that's the thing. Class plus national liberation, ultimately producing a new world democratic movement.
Well,
That's kind of where Leninism, the logic of it led.
yeah, well, because the reason why Lenin becomes, I think, more important is that in some ways you could say that Putin is not an aberration of Leninism, but Putin in some ways you could say is a long result of maybe a Leninist vision, right? The same way that Xi Jinping is not an aberration of anything, but in fact Xi Jinping is a fulfillment of, like, in some ways Xi Jinping is a fulfillment of maybe even a long path that began with Sun Yat-sen. And I feel like that becomes important because Leninism, like you were saying, you were like, I did not join a national party. I was consciously joining a world movement, which is another way of saying I was joining a struggle that had certain ideological or philosophic foundations that were beyond, like, that in some ways I was joining like a movement that had philosophic or ideological foundations around even a concept of democracy, like world democracy, that even in America, the struggle for American democracy fits under,
Yes.
that we can explain better today because of the turning of epochs from like the age of Europe to an age of humanity. But that in some ways, even this world movement at that time, like the Russian Revolution, the anti-colonial struggles, that we now have a language to explain it as actually the beginnings of a fulfillment of what today is. If this makes sense. Because I just think it becomes important because of the social system analysis. I think is really important because.
Can I just, because you asked about why would we not call it a civilizational white supremacist system?
Yeah.
And I don't have an answer for that, because it is a question of how does civilization factor into all of this, which is paramount in this moment of transformation. And all I would answer is I don't exactly know how to do it, but I do have a better way of understanding the American social crisis and the what I would call the explanatory framing of the crisis. And I would say it is in a social system that is white supremacist. And that makes it concrete for me in ways, although I know civilization is overarching.
Well, actually, hearing your response made me think that in some ways the reason why, especially with the American crisis, it makes more sense to stick to like an understanding of the crisis being a battle between a white supremacist social system and a Black freedom social system that's both you could say within it, but also at the same time outside of it and in battle with it, is that to say that America is a white civilization is to erase basically that it was never a given that America is part of white civilization. That actually, in some ways, that's why, because America cannot be said to be white civilization, right? In some ways, because of the existence of a Black freedom social system, which is to say, right, the struggle of the Black proletariat since his forceful like bringing to the continent, that there was always an immediate contest to the existence of this being a white place, which is in some ways why the social system is a more accurate. The battle of social systems.
I want to ask a question about that though. What would be the definition of white civilization? Like, because I can understand what a Black civilization is when you go to the music, but wouldn't white civilization have to encompass Europe or something? But then what would white?
See, this is that's one of the things I was going to say. There is something unique and specific about the American situation. The social system, one could easily articulate the European social system in many ways, but not in the same way as a white supremacist social system. Because slavery, in any real sense, never existed in European countries in the way it existed and was so much foundational to the formation of the American nation, American state.
No, I was thinking, what is white civilization?
Yeah, but that's another question too. Yeah. I think white
No. Well, what I was going to add was that, well, in some ways, I think white civilization is a modern invention. Because Western man is a more modern terminology. I think the early, I mean, not the earliest, but earlier than Western was the concept of white. Oh, wait a second.
White people and white civilization, which only later is defined as Western man.
Yeah.
The first articulation is as white nations, white civilization, white culture, white. That's why, I was saying the last time, white people say, well, why you got to always racialize everything by calling it white civilization, which I say, well, I'm only following what white people said. I am white, and therefore my civilization is white. And that's part of the colonial articulation of world humanity, where white is superior and Black and brown and yellow are less than. But it was I'm sorry.
No, because.
And I think that's accurate, that Western is a later articulation.
Well, because I actually think Israel is in some ways, I think Israel is a good example of this, where Baldwin makes a point to say that whether you're a German immigrant, Irish immigrant, like whatever immigrant, you were never white when you were in Europe. You only became white when you came to America. But he says at the same time, ironically, there is no such thing as a white people in America. So, which is why he says Israel in some ways, or in some ways, I guess maybe we said in free school, we were like Israelis or Jews who claim to be Israeli. In some ways, they are super white. Because they're super white. Super white is that they never had to be white or claim to be white. That's a new thing for Israelis to basically be white, like a white nation. Because it's not like French. It's not like France historically was ever like, we're white. They were like, we're French. Or like, and it's only until you come to America are you white now, and because white is predicated on Black. Yes. And then Baldwin also says it's not even like African Americans were ever Black before we came to America. We only became Black when we came to America because of this white supremacist social system.
Yes.
And so in some ways, that's what makes Israel so.
And that is so valuable. If I might interrupt, this is so interesting because the trajectory, let us say a French person coming to the United States or Russian coming to the United States, the trajectory of their social constitution, how they are constituted as a social human being, and hence how their identity is formed, changes radically once they're in the United States. So it's no longer Russian, it's now white, you know, because the social system is so radically and fundamentally different. The same with a French person. His or her identity and the trajectory of their identity formation has to change once in the United States. Well, let's keep it 100. Chinese. You know what I'm saying? We have our Chinese community, but we exist and play by the rules of the white supremacist social system. So so you say a Chinese in California and a Chinese in Shanghai are different. The identity formation, the social positioning, the norms and rules of social life and social interaction are fundamentally different. Now, this is Kathy again, but Taiwan and South Korea, they're playing more by the rules of the white supremacist social system, which is kind of ironic and crazy because you don't have no black people in Taiwan. So you're playing by the rules of a white supremacist social system when you really don't need to. So you become, why? But you really don't have to play by them rules. But then you do because you associate the white supremacist social system, and this is how ideology then distorts the Chinese in Taiwan, and to a lesser extent in Hong Kong, distorts their being and their identity because they're playing by norms that are imposed upon them for a situation that they don't even live in. So, but then the other thing is it makes it more comfortable to transition from South Korea or Taiwan to the United States because I know how the game is played. White supremacist social system. It's very interesting. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we're gonna say something. Well, I was gonna make a leap, which I don't know is accurate. Do you think that also let's just take Israel, South Korea, and Taiwan, for example. Do you think that's the kind of, in some ways, devastating thing, which is
Well, Israel is another case altogether because the Israelis apply the norms and rules of the American whites supremacist social system to the Arabs.
Yeah, so I was gonna say they had to create a black man, right? Where
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think that in some ways the danger is that, let's take South Korea, that South Korea will make North Korea a black, like that they will feel like they, you know?
Well, but see, the thing is, they exist in a negation.
Okay.
See, once European people said we are white, they are saying we exist as a negation. You know? So it's a crazy, it's almost the theater of the absurd, where you're living a fake existence. Now, the Israelis are organically white. They become white because they are negation. But let's take Taiwan. Okay, you exist by the rules of a white supremacist social system and thus see yourself in a negation of, okay, but now it's not you, white supremacist social system negation of black. Now you're negating Chinese. Well, damn, you're negating your own damn self. You're negation. As Hegel said, you a negation of a negation.
And not in a good way.
Not So you say to a cat, hey, dig, man, you live in a negation of a negation by trying to be white in Taiwan. Go ahead.
I was actually just flipping back through my notes, but well, I just also really want to appreciate how you took your time and laid out, like even the chronology or even a sense of how the emergence of the like European social system, but also even I really also appreciated like how like there like your analysis of like from Marx and Engels and Lenin, but also what like the contributions philosophically, ideologically, morally of the Soviet Union, but also these shortcomings of the economic, the overdetermining of the economic over like the sociological, the human being. And I feel like that is actually a very important characterization or a deepening of the understanding of the white supremacist social system, like coming from its European origins, but then I feel like we're now fleshing it out through like our understanding of the American, but also like very current world system that is configured. But also I'm just going back to like Nandita's sort of opening remarks when we first started talking about the Black social system, and even how she was describing like how Asia's social systems are very diverse, but like the American social system is very homogenous. But I remember now, I was like, it took me a while, but now this conversation's I'm only now catching up to what was said before around how the immigrant Asian family is exhibiting a very different type of social system than the Asian social system in Asia. And I feel like this is exactly why, like the mediation of the white supremacist social system. So I'm just catching up literally, and also how
this is very important. The mediation of whiteness in the lives of the Asians.
Yeah.
This is,
but then we're extending it. But we're extending it not just to the immigrant in America, we're also extending it to an understanding of the social system in a place like Taiwan and South Korea, maybe in the Philippines and whatnot. But also, I feel like I'm just sitting a little bit more with the idea of how important it is, like what Nantita said about Afro-American being the first modern colored peoples, and how important it is for like a society, like all like modern like society on their path to trying to seek a new like place, role, or like responsibility towards modernity and like the realignment, how important it is to look to the Black social system as a highly advanced social system with that capacity for that very heightened capacity for resistance, for struggle. And I think that is also what we're saying about what it means to fulfill a certain kind of new, or like the generation of like the path that has to be taken for the American, like to be able to make this social system the American social system. But how that's to be achieved, I think, is something we're working out through the year of Baldwin and trying to work all of these ideas out. But I think it just really helped, not to jump back and forth so much, but definitely really helped to walk through how important it was to even lay out almost like a methodology of understanding a social system, like the philosophical, the dialectical, but even the understanding of sociology of Du Bois. And I think at one point when you had brought up like how will the Chinese social system fit into this, I was like, we're going to cover a lot, aren't we? But it also was a question of like, so are we? But I think what we're setting up here is actually the frameworks and the tools and the ways to be able to dive deeper into what is, like, I do agree, like what you were saying about, like, the fact is, like, it is like the restoration, the reconstruction of modern China under Xi Jinping is not just an economic task, but actually the development of a new social system. That I think was really important, because at one point I was thinking to myself, what are the determining sort of features or like in the Chinese social system? Is it Confucianism? But I think that's something of like the idea of the new, and the fact that even something like Confucianism is something that seems like Xi Jinping is, including in like let's understand where we came from, but a very important, I feel like, thread that I realized in like the kind of the period of Sun Yat-sen, or even like a Song Qingming was thinking, like Confucianism has reached a certain expiration date in trying to make sense of like new social relations between Chinese people, men and women, families, like
political leaders to their subjects and that sort of thing, but it is still an important part. So I feel like it's also something more so than we can say like what kind of conclusive answers we can come to about what is the new Chinese social system in emergence that we do see very clearly. Much more, I feel like that we really, I feel like we really gained something really valuable in what you were laying out in terms of what it meant, what it means to like what do we need to study, what kind of like whether it's like preconditions, understanding of what like again the human being over the individual, or what sort of things like help us, or the Du Boisian sort of framework help us even be able to see and interpret what is being developed, and also point to where it must go in this moment. So I think that was really valuable. I just want to say never feel as if you spoke for too long, because all of it was, I was taking furious notes. There's a lot that I want to come back to, and I think we'll find really, really important for much more to come.
Well, in some ways, can't you say that actually, even with China, that the reason why it doesn't make sense to call it a civilizational analysis is because Sun Yat-sen through Xi Jinping, I guess you identified as the 1840s, it was the beginning of the struggle to create a new social system. But that doesn't mean new civilization inherently at that beginning. But in some ways, I kind of, the way I see it, and tell me if this is wrong or doesn't make sense, but in some ways, actually, even with China, what Xi Jinping's doing is he's trying to develop a new social system that could produce a new civilization.
Well,
right?
yes, I hear, I would just be a little more cautious. In, I think I only, what I was doing in a comparative way, the white supremacist social system, the black social system, and the Chinese social system. It is very apparent, and we can see and explain it, and the Chinese leadership explain it, that they are constructing a new social system. However, it is a new social system within the long arc of Chinese civilization. And this is why Song Ching Ling would say one thing about Confucianism, and Xi Jinping would suggest something different. But this is an assessment of Chinese civilization. But that's a whole nother set of questions and investigations. However, for our purposes, and I only brought in China to suggest that this is not just the crisis for America or the situation in America, because my motivation was to say it is upon this framing, this analysis, that we can see the struggle, its objectives, its moral and revolutionary imperatives. It is, in fact, the undoing of the system in the name of democracy. And very, very much James Lawson, very much James Lawson, where he too understood that it is not just the redoing of the economic system, it is the undoing of a social system that in its totality is determinative. It is not the economic system that determines the legal, it is the social system that in its multiple parts and in its totality is determinative of itself. And that is what must be broken. Now, I didn't answer the outstanding question, and please maybe give me a week to think it through. What are the stages in this process? We see social collapse. We're seeing the economy looks like, well, as the, if I'm talking too much, the economists will say the economy is doing perfect. The stock market is up, unemployment is down, we're getting inflation under control. Vote for Biden. Okay. But that's not what we're talking about. Even if the economy is doing good, and it's not, it's producing inequality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even if it is doing as good as the bourgeois economists say it is doing. Well, so that has not addressed the crisis. The crisis is social systemic. The crisis is social systemic. And the answer to this crisis, the resolution of it, must be social systemic. But it first must understand how to analyze it. And it can't be 19th century. It can't be the three component parts of the 19th century. It has to be a new framing, a new frame. And that's why Du Bois, Baldwin, King, all of that. That's why to understand the alternative social system that could not be undone. That the resilience of the Black social system, which is not in the same degree of crisis as the white supremacist social system is, which one could even say represents a huge accomplishment of the Black social system, that its resilience, weakened though it be, but it is not in crisis like the white supremacist social system, hence on the cusp of collapse. Now, just one other small thing. Remember, I kind of cited that part in Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, where they said that either society goes forward or there could be the ruin of all classes. That period, and always in a crisis like this, the possibility of ruin of society and thus ungovernability, the inability to find the energy, the unity, the ideas to move forward. Well, in some ways, we're looking at that. That's why people are so afraid. I have a friend. He's, everything was cool when we would talk and so on, when he thought Biden was going to win. But now when it looks like Biden ain't going to win and Trump is coming to North Philly, the guy is panicking. I'm saying, calm down. Stop being a punk, man. Face the reality. But it's not easy to face. It's not easy to face. I understand that. But I just say that to go forward and to give justification for our approach, for our worldview. And I think our approach and our worldview has something to say and something to offer that says that in this, first of all, this Black social system and all that it has given this country and humanity, almost a great sacrifice, a great contribution. And this is why Nundutha has a point. In the vanguard of colored modernity, I'll put it that way, maybe not the first, but in the vanguard of colored modernity, there is no two ways about it. Black people stand with every great movement of the modern time. Whether we this is not to be underestimated. Not to see that is not to see the possible way out for the American people. I guess that's what I was trying to say.
Could I ask actually, I wanted to ask briefly if you could tease out that point you made earlier about a double negation being
Negation of the negation.
Yeah, actually for the Taiwanese, actually.
Well, I was using it satirically, but the idea of negation is at the foundation of Hegelian logic. I remember when I said this, I said dialectical logic is logic based upon negation. And I remember this is 2 years ago, maybe more. And Jeremiah said, negation, a negative, a logic based upon a negative, you know. But it is. Dialectical logic is a logic of negation. Now, I was being satirical, maybe not so satirical, in talking about, let us say, the Taiwanese immigrant living a negation that is whiteness, a negation, but a negation that negates him or her. So, in other words, because I think so much about the way you tell me about how you grew up, your community. It's so interesting to me. I always think about it. And I said, oh, they're living a negation of a negation.
Oh, interesting.
A negation in the United States, even not in Taiwan, in the United States, the white social system is a negation. But then you're living but a negation that negates you. I mean, you're in a double bind, as they say. You got distracted on the way to grandmother's house.
Wait, but how is that different from white people living in that social system?
It ain't that different,
Mm,
except that you're not white,
right.
no matter how much you want to be white. And that's the bind.
Right.
That's why y'all in the free school represent the new and thus the vanguard.
Right, right.
That's why you, Michelle, are so interesting always to me. Because you introduced me to some of the most interesting people from Southern California. And you're always saying to them, listen, this is the way we have to go. We can't follow what our parents expected of us.
Right.
I know Sylvia, I know Crystal, I know
Simon.
Yeah, I know all these people. And you always come to free school, come to Philadelphia.
Well, I feel like this conversation, what it clarifies for me is why, like if people can find their way to the human question or to the question of the human being over the question of the individual, then you, like, I feel like that's the breakthrough into like a more advanced theory, a more advanced form of struggle, which is, for example, why even though all of these leftists were carrying out pro-Palestine protests over the span of 6 months, it's only when the students who organically linked it to the moral dimension, the existential, the human question, who am I going to be and what am I going to stand for? And am I going to be, what does it mean to be an intellectual?
And what am I prepared to sacrifice?
Yes. Did it actually, I mean, you saw a flip in the way the world responded. This was I think it was the most advanced form of like pro-Palestinian, unified pro-Palestine protests that we saw in America. And it's for that reason. But I also say that because
I would say the most consequential. Excuse me for interrupting.
No, yeah. Well, but I also asked about the Taiwanese people because, for example, when I interact with youth that are Taiwanese in Taiwan, I think they have a much looser grasp on even this concept of the human being. And you see it in how they apply it to their own lives, is how much do they think about their own striving or even test this question of like, who am I and what have I inherited and what will I inherit? Which I think is the leading edge of like, let's say young Asians in America. I think that happens more with Asians in America than Taiwanese in Taiwan. I'm not like, I won't speak to the Chinese like youth yet, but like I feel that, and I have to think more about it, but their questions are much more individualistic still. how will I hit certain levers within a certain system? Like, how will I, you know, do you know what I'm saying?
I hear you
It's
completely.
very interesting, but I think I also
Yes.
say that because, well, the way that you define Du Boisian sociology, I think is very consequential, like a study of human capacity. And I liked how earlier you described the crisis being total, because the crisis is not merely, it's certainly not merely economic, it's also legal, it's political, but it's also ideological, it's cultural, it's spiritual. And actually, when you began listing it off, I felt a little anxious because it was like, oh God, there's that category, and then there's that, and then there's that. But what this conversation is making me realize is that if you depart from the human being, which is, I would argue, the natural departure point for especially like a young mind, it's actually very easy to synthesize and to think from the standpoint of the interaction of these categories, because, you know, I mean, that's how, I mean, human beings are complex, and like young people are very complex, and their minds are very complex. And I think what I'm also trying to say is, for some reason, this takes me back. Actually, it's something that Emily had me thinking about this week too, because she told me about a conversation you had been having. But Baldwin as a revolutionary theorist, or as a theorist of the American revolutionary process, and how it engages the complexity, like, you know, the complexity in the human being, and how I feel that this is our only way into maybe what you might call a unified theory, a non-Western European way of thinking, which is so categorical when we're at a cusp, you know, we're at a cusp in world history where, I mean, all of these categories have to be bent, and yes, categories are valuable, but the dialectical relationship between all of these categories is of, I think, heightened importance right now.
This, but I just a quick thing. You know, Kathy, in her describing her trip to China and her observations upon it, talked about the Deng Xiaoping period versus the Xi Jinping period, where the excessive concern with economic and material questions and benefit has had somewhat of a devastating impact upon young people. So much so that she, you know, you might want to describe where you talked about young people who were wearing civilizational clothing and trying to identify with something beyond the material, the economic.
Right. Well, can I also say, also the revolutionary theory of the civil rights movement, because my mind is coming back to Baldwin's formulation of nonviolence and Kingian philosophy as bringing the political struggle into the interior life. The interior,
Yes.
and I'm making sense of that in a new way.
This is very, yes.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I hear
Because
you.
it's a question of how, I mean, the nonviolent method by which you transform yourself in order to bend or break or transform the social system around you. Like, I feel like there's something, I mean, that's a different formation of struggle, which I think, which I don't think had been crystallized in this way before the civil rights movement. Because, I mean, the legal system, you know, like the legal system is what people, the transformation of law, people associate that with the civil rights movement. But what they don't understand is that the transformation was, that outer transformation was a consequence of a disciplined, strategic, unified, like inner transformation.
That's right. But it assumed the existence of a Black social system, out of which this great struggle in other words, the struggle did not create the social system. It was the social system that produces all of this. Yes.
Well, because we've talked about this a little bit in reading group as well, like the Wednesday reading group, but Baldwin's last novel, Just Above My Head, is so much centered on like these relationships between
Hmm.
Like, yeah, whatever, the relationships between people who love one another.
Yeah, see,
But-
if I could just make a small
Yeah,
point.
sure,
See,
sure.
remember we were talking about the macro,
Yes.
meso meaning
Yes.
middle, and Mike.
Yes.
See, Baldwin is doing so many things. We found this in our reading group at the Free Library, difficult, where the novels are looking at the micro, the
Right.
individual existing in this contradiction of
Right.
two social systems, as it were,
Well, what I wanted to say
and
is,
what it produces. Yeah.
I feel like what's understated, or at least what kept pulling at my mind while we were reading it,
Yes.
is this burning question of what would the implications be if this world that we saw in Baldwin's novel became the broader public inheritance of America, and what does that process look like, by which the Black social system becomes the prevailing social system?
Yeah.
See, this is so.
Well, because I actually think that's something that in some ways, like I personally got wrong about the Third American Revolution. I actually think, in fact, maybe Baldwin as a witness to, and a theorist of, in some ways, coming out of the civil rights movement or the Black freedom struggle, that actually some people would say some people misunderstand the civil rights movement as like, oh, there's okay, in our language, be like, there's no like social, or like we've reduced let's say we've reduced the color line, or we've reduced the existence of two social systems. When actually the objective is to make the objective, in some ways you could say, in some ways in America, inherently in the democratic revolutionary struggle, it's not only in defense of the black freedom.
So you
social
can just say
system.
Black social system.
It's not, in some ways you inherently have to defend the Black social system and assert the Black social system is supposed to become the social system. Okay, in some ways we're a little bit of evidence of that too, right? That in some ways, without us knowing, what we do by even listening to Black music and saying, "Oh, this is the best music on this like continent. This is the only creative music," or like, right? We're not just talking about in defense of an economic theory that the Black social system proposes, but we're talking about the music, the culture, the ideas, the kinds of people, the character that's produced by social. In some ways, I see this as we were not simply doing like ideological struggle. In some ways, is also in defense of
Absolutely.
the
This
Black
is
social
very-
system.
Wait, could I say
Yeah,
one more
yeah.
thing?
Go.
No, because the other thing I was thinking about was I was rereading this essay by Amiri Baraka, which I think is a later essay in his life, and it's a short one, but it's called Black Music as a Force for Social Change. And so this goes back to a point that someone had made earlier, but he says, who could enslave Duke Ellington or Art Tatum? Could you seriously believe someone who told you Sun Ra or Coltrane were inferior? And he said, if such art is allowed to exist, it will influence people, even white people.
Say that again. If such a
It will influence people,
Oh, yeah.
even white people.
No
Okay, so
No
for me,
question.
this is I mean, this is to the point of the primary defense. Like this point of the primary defense, but later in the essay he talks about how if in the halls of schools they played Black music, like people were allowed to hear this music, he says this, that it would cleave the gap between what Du Bois calls double consciousness into a true consciousness.
Yeah, I agree. That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. No, it's very true. And I apropos what I'm sorry, Jeremiah, just let me just make one response. I think what you all are saying is very important, and that is what makes the free school unique. Can I just
Sure.
tell a story? It's relevant because it comes out of our reading group
Yes.
and at the free library. And a woman who is a friend of mine, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this if she sees it. She raised the question because I introduced Purba and Nanditha, and I introduced them to the reading group at the free library. And of course, maybe with too much for the sister, too much passion and too much celebration of them. And she said, well, Gandhi was a racist. And because we had to get on with the reading of Baldwin, I said, no, he wasn't. And I said, no freedom fighter would make that claim, but then she held on to that for a couple of weeks. She called me and she said, she wanted to continue that discussion. But my point is precisely your point, that if Gandhi is a racist and King and Lawson and Diane Nash and Coretta and others were Gandhian, if they were celebrants of a racist and of a racist ideology, then that meant that the civil rights movement was not a freedom struggle at all, that it embraced anti-Black ideas, which is the point, of course, that the attack is not essentially upon Gandhi, the attack is upon the civil rights movement itself and the authority and integrity of Martin Luther King and others. You know what I'm saying? And that is a project that goes back to the civil rights movement, where it has been attacked, diminished, demeaned, even by those who claim to celebrate it. But certainly, this form of identity politics, be it gender, sexuality, or racial identity politics, is such an attack. And what you were saying, Emily, I think is absolutely right. And it is our message, let us say, to the various Marxist groups around, that until you understand and embrace the Black movement, as you say, part of the vanguard of colored modernity, and if you don't understand that, you're just talking shit. Good, I'm sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
this also clarifies why you always bring up this point that Winston made a primary defense of King
Yes.
and the movement in his theory.
And a strategic one, and which was not in line with that. For example, I heard, like, okay, a guy Hans, when he don't nobody take it personally. But Hans and them, they talk about going back to communism, American communism, and William Z. Foster. So I'm saying, well, I'm not, all due respect, he comes out of the international workers of the world, kind of a anarchist syndicalist movement. It's all good. I'm down. I appreciate it. But that's not the epistemic and ideological foundation. It is Henry Winston who understood what the Third American Revolution was about, and Strategy for a Black Agenda is a unapologetic defense of that. You can't defend that. You can't see anything and you can't go forward. That's the weakness of the identity politics thing, of the quote Marxist, disenchanted former followers of Bernie Sanders. Well, look, okay, I'm not hating. But what you need to know, you can't learn in 2 years, especially since you're reading the wrong books. So on and so forth, man. Excuse my interrupting. Go ahead, Jerry. I'm sorry, Ted.
Yeah, I was like writing down things as you guys were talking. Is it okay if I just kind of like talk through also
yeah,
like
man.
what I'm thinking in response to like your presentation? Well, basically, I think like also like Kathy said that the importance of all this and like why we're talking about it is like you said in the beginning, that periods of crisis demand a new theory to make sense of the current moment.
I usually say new and better theory.
New and better.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so like it's not like both to
Not
make
just
sense,
new,
to make sense of the current moment and also to like let in the theory to penetrate and uncover and make real the actual revolutionary possibilities in that moment. And I think basically my sense of many people on the left is that their mentality is like, if we can, like you said, if we can just go back to Marxism, if we can just explain to people the underlying cause of their like material conditions, then they will somehow just join us in like a new revolutionary movement. And I think that obviously like we disagree with that on a fundamental basis, and on a scientific basis as well, because we're also trying, like, I feel like the Free Souls Project is basically trying to go deeper into the human beings who make up the society or shaped by it, and will also become victimized by the society unless they're able to see themselves in a new revolutionary way. But this is also, I think, the big thing that I was thinking about, similar to what you guys were saying, though, is like this question of the logic of history. Because this also came up in the science conference, where, yeah, like the thing that's very comforting and easy about Marxism is that it gives you that unified theory of human history, where it gives you like a very clear-cut kind of progression of like the motive force of history.
Right.
And I think it was interesting because I was thinking about like Winston and strategy, where interestingly, I was remembering a certain passage where Winston talked about that, when he was making a critique of Maoism, where like part of Winston's critique of Maoism and of the cultural nationalists was that Winston was like, we can never say that quote unquote race is the chief dynamic of history. But I think that's also his response to Maoists, who are basically insisting that there are these almost natural divisions in the world and in human civilization, of like almost that race is an inherent thing rather than something which is created in the modern epoch. But I just feel like that's important because like I think that Winston was thinking about this question though of like basically like the deeper question of like logic of history. And I think at the same time, I don't know if we are exactly saying what Winston was saying back in like the 1970s. I think that we're actually reaching for something new, which is essentially like a new totality and a new science. And I think my question kind of latent within that is it necessary even to identify a unified or singular motive force of history anymore?
I don't think so.
Or is it more of a complex interrelation of forces? Because that's also, I think, where King in Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, that's part of his critique of Marxism, where he says, this is from like the Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, where he says, quote, Marx interpreted economic forces as the dialectical process by which society moved from feudalism to capitalism to socialism, with the primary mechanism of this historical movement being the struggle between economic classes whose interests were irreconcilable. Obviously, this theory left out of account numerous and significant complexities, political, economic, moral, religious, and psychological, which played a vital role in shaping the constellation of institutions and ideas known today as Western civilization. And I just feel like this is important because I think if we are basically putting forward like almost like a new, well, not just the sociology thing, but that also implies like a new kind of approach to like thinking about history and the logic of history, which I feel like we're still working out. But I think that poses questions in terms of like part of the reason why Marxism is appealing, I think, for a lot of young people is like the answer to the revolutionary demand is very obvious. It's like, oh, social, like that literally is it. And I think that if we are saying that it's not that simple, that human history and what drives human history is not just one thing, then I think that creates a new kind of dynamic in terms of how we understand whether there is a revolutionary demand. What is that revolutionary demand? What are the conditions that create the need for that demand? And I think similarly, when we say that there is a white supremacist social system and that this is also an object of study, that's not just to simply basically replace capitalism. And yeah, like again, we're reaching for like what feels to me like a more total investigation, like you're saying, of like the multiple levels operating simultaneously within their own logics, but also in relation to each other. And I think this also deals with the question of like world systems analysis, where I think one question that I feel like is also put on the table is, this is also like related to Lenin, but is imperialism essentially just a stage of capitalist development? And is the world system also essentially just a capitalist system?
Right.
Which I think is how many people frame it. I feel like these are open questions I feel like we can like talk about, but this I feel like a part of what's put on the table by what we're discussing. And then also I think the main thing I want to get to though was essentially this question of like the American context, where the historical logic of American history and hence essentially the future of America, which means the resolution of the current crisis, of a white supremacist social system and then the black social system, that logic is not the same as the logic of overcoming capitalism.
No.
It has to be a different, we have to operate according to a different logic. Because the logic of the overcoming of capitalism means basically it's like, yeah, the liquidation of a certain social class and you know, that kind of thing. And I think the logic that we're reaching for, at least this is like my intuitive feeling, is that the resolution of the crisis of America and of our social system essentially means like what Michelle and what we've been saying earlier, which is like, yeah, the transformation of human beings and of their total social, ideological, political, and economic relations. And I think in that, like, this is also where I feel like nonviolence comes in, and nonviolence becomes a key, because nonviolence, I think Emily had said this before, but like the Black freedom movement essentially brought these two social systems into an overt confrontation with each other. And white people especially were essentially completely disarmed of their supremacist ideology, which was essentially like revealed to them as basically a fantasy and a lie. And I think also like the interesting thing that I was realizing as you were talking that nonviolence also did was to bring together the micro, the meso level and the macro level contradictions of American society. So both the individual, but then also like even contradictions in like a city, for instance, but then also basically the contradictions of America as a whole. Like nonviolence brought all of those together in like one kind of like public, but also very private like moment of confrontation.
Could I just say, so we're talking about the nonviolent movement.
The nonviolent movement,
Yes,
basically the civil rights movement.
That's,
Yeah. And I feel like that's really important too. But the last thing I want to say was also around this question of democracy and what you were saying of like Du Bois and Baldwin's and King's philosophy of like the human being and human capacity, where I think part of what's really interesting about this, like the current crisis, is that the undemocratic nature of the American system, which all Americans feel,
right.
on some level is highlighted exactly by the failure of the individualistic and rational choice formulation of Western liberal democracy, in which people realize it's like, it's so stupid for me to think that this system is democratic simply because I have a vote, right? And then where it's like, people, it's like, yeah, like this whole notion that like, yeah, like people vote as individuals, you vote in your best interest, but that has not stopped happening, but it's like people feel more acutely than maybe ever before in American history that like that is not sufficient for
which they're saying, and which Michelle said the suit, that no matter how rational I am,
right.
I will still not be successful
Right.
in the system. That rationality is a myth.
Right.
It will not determine outcomes because the system itself does not operate on rational principles. Maybe certain economic decision making, but the system is not operating upon rational principle. The principle generator, that's what I'm thinking, is the production and reproduction of white supremacy within the borders of the United States and globally.
Well,
My last point was yeah, like when we say that there is a demand for a revolutionary and democratic and emancipatory struggle for the American
That's what
today,
yes,
that
yes.
essentially means that they have to embrace like and act upon like a new subjectivity and a new kind of consciousness.
I could agree.
Or it's like like basically it's like a new sense of themselves as like agents of history.
I would agree with that. The process of the reconstitution of the human, of the individual as a human being, and this is why all of these studies of music and art, and because these become the ways of showing what is the human. This is why, the music and the moral content of the music is so important. This is what, I don't care how you cut it. Donny Hathaway. In this, let me I'll shut up.
About that to me though is the definition of like, I don't know if the artist was defined or like how it was exactly defined by Europe. For instance, there's Paul Robeson, the artist as revolutionary. It's a criteria of Negro art. There's The Art of Struggle for Integrity by Baldwin, or Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare by Baldwin, or what was the bigger one that he did? But like the defining of the artist as a part of like a society, like that's just kind of like I'm working that out in that conversation that you're bringing up about Just Above My Head, the last novel that Baldwin wrote, about nonviolence, meaning like the freedom movement and what people, like you had mentioned, Lawson, who's a product in a sense, create like somebody whose art, whose personal and political art in his life had such a quality, I think, that
This is heavy, man.
I think I need to look into more. How was that? What is it? And where did it, well, in a sense, I can answer where did it come from more than I can answer what did it become in a sense. But I am trying to also answer that question the same as Baldwin. Like, I can understand where he came from, but how did he, where was he? And in a sense, I can also kind of answer where he was going. Because I think that the free school is a certain product. Like, and I don't mean that to be self-conscious, but I mean that in a serious sense of like, where Baldwin wanted to go was an awesome articulation of what you had mentioned, the Black freedom social system as the general, or like, because when you think about that for me, right, there's a lot of ways that like people bring in aspects of yourself, whether that, and you can just see that in free school, for instance, when Derek comes into free school, he speaks in a certain way. And the poetics, the imaginary, the descriptions of life also affect how one is to relate to Derek, for instance, you know, and how you examine basically or investigate a particular point. And I'm only bringing that up because I'm trying to explain explain something like, for instance, what does the Black freedom social system in effect do, and then what becomes of a person, basically. Because the first thing for me is kind of trying to, and I think I kind of trying to answer the question that you posed. What is the imperative that moves history? And I think love is a category that we still don't, or we haven't articulated in a certain sense. But as an imperative, I think that's how I'm framing that word in my mind, or that concept, or that framework in my head, because of like the beloved community, for instance, or like what it isn't really a question of what moves forward or backwards or something like that, but in the nature of what can explain, like you were trying to mention, complexities. I think love is a certain, and I only mention that because I think that how is it, the other question, how is it that there is a Black freedom social system, and what does it operate? How does it adjust to struggle against a differing social system, and or a social system that is supposed to operate to dismantle or deny the human being, or deny the deny that there is Asia, Africa, Black people, in essence, to prove itself as one who can conquer the entire thing, right? And so love is a certain quality that can explain how freedom is the mode of operating.
Say that one more time.
How love can explain why explain how there is a life world dependent on freedom, or a life world that
It's interesting.
is dependent on the democratic struggle for freedom in America. And because I think Lawson, like, okay, the only reason why I'm picking out these people to explain, like Derek or Lawson, is because there's something that your whiteness cannot define in these people. How is it that you have such an open mind, or how is it so youthful, or how is it that, like, I don't think that whiteness can explain many of those qualities that come out of a certain struggle, or that come out. And so so
That's right. I hear you.
because the other thing that I'm been debating about the Just Above My Head book, because I've been trying to write something about it, and I booked up on Mondays. I've been reading it, and then we were thinking about also studying the Black Freedom Movement, and then I went into like what you had mentioned earlier, Michelle, about how the Black Freedom Movement was a basis, like a certain basis of the struggle, like of an American people. Because I think there's two things. The thing about civilization is a kind of a separate question, meaning that it's an interesting question, because I think that the arc of civilization people care about, because they want to be a part of it, like, and then you want to say, well, like the civil rights movement did inject humanity, like, into, like, make civilization. Then, okay, the only reason why that's separate than what I'm trying to say is that I think there is something to be studied about the Black Freedom Movement, and how that it was an exemplar of the Black freedom social system.
That's right. I agree.
Basically turning inside out like a sock, like turning inside out the literal management and moral directions, like the moral fiber of human beings. Like, there's no way that Diane Nash could have just called whoever was the president just to be like, I've signed my wills already. Like, there's something significant that had happened in Nepal, or there's something significant how it happens in the dialogues of study of nonviolence, that that was the basis of a movement. There's something very, like you had said, Jeremiah, individual and like very I guess macro, but it doesn't agree with that, about that, about the Black freedom movement. But I guess on the other hand, you have Baldwin and how he's trying to explain a process of a democratic struggle, and its arc between the beginnings of its movement, which in essence was after the period of Reconstruction, into like the early I'm trying to. So, like, the arc of America was also something that Baldwin is describing throughout this novel. And I guess when he's also trying to explain something at the end, which is what I'm trying to think about more. Like, why does he end with what he says? And I think that's why I'm thinking something about preschool. That's why I'm thinking something about love, or like, and not to be like overly poetic. I'm just trying to be specific, like, about what inheritance, or what are the, like, I think when you get to the specifics, for example, with the book club this past Thursday, we discussed if Baldwin was right or wrong, or like got the concept right about power as what was it, like,
the ability to make
that has nothing to do with morality, right?
Yeah.
as separate from morality. So I think when you get to the specifics, there's a lot to still discuss, like power, like it, like the ideological, the philosophical. Like I think that's also something that happens in the Black community all the time. Like something that, like what perspectives are, you know. But I think that if there's something about like the overarching arc. Like if you still hold on to King, like if you still hold on to Gandhi, like if you still hold on to Lawson, you still hold on to Du Bois or Baldwin, then you have something. And it's not a question of minor discussions of political ideologies and philosophy in of itself. In essence, like I think we can agree that there shouldn't be poor people, or that in essence, I think the state could function in specific ways. But I think there is something said about the human being and how what is it, the framework to suggest actually what is it of the future that we're actually gearing towards.
But that will actually what?
Like we're gearing towards something in the future. Like
This is good. I hear you completely. Yeah, go ahead.
no, that's all I'm really trying to get at. And I think that's a project that the free school is doing.
It's oh, go ahead. No, let me show. I talk too much.
No, I want you to say it.
See, I think that you know, Theodore Parker, The Arc of the Moral Universe is long, but it bends to justice. You could read that as a teleology, that human beings will be free because the end of human striving is always freedom. But then you could read that in another way, that the arc of human striving predisposes humanity to love as a expression, the highest expression of human solidarity. And that's the message of the New Testament of the Bible, the life of Jesus. And that's, you know, Howard Thurman and that to fulfill ourselves as human beings, we must love one another. Because as John said, God is love.
Right.
And if you do not love, you do not, you know, you can't, if you don't love your brother and sister, you can't love God. You know, so I think that I agree with you. It is a superior way of thinking to the rational individual, where everything is selfish. This is what I mean. You can't get around it. That liberal philosophy, liberal political theory, is a selfishness. You know, there is no outwardness. There is no empathy. There is no love. If you reframe the democratic struggle as a fulfillment of the human. See, this is what Marx and them talked about as communism, as the new man, new woman. And when that would ever be achieved, no one could ever say. But what you were saying, what I think we're all saying, is that it is upon us. And it is, you know, we are almost, when I say almost there, I don't mean tomorrow or next week, but we're closer than we know. And that there is the philosophical and life experience of the Indian independence, of the Black freedom movement, of the Vietnamese, of, you know, humanity has demonstrated this and is demonstrating it. So I ain't making myself as clear as I want to, but I would say that that superseding the philosophy that centralizes the individual and European rationality, the answer to that is not in more individualism like LGBTQ individualism, like Judith Butler's individualism, but is in the arc of the moral universe, the arc of the realization of the human being. is in the realization of love, which is a totally abused word.
It's abused.
You never understand it by understanding how it is used. You have to understand it by understanding it in its relationship to freedom. Yes, I would say that. To love is to see oneself in everybody else and to see everybody else in you.
Right.
Oh, so-
No, yeah, well, you know, I don't know if I can be very coherent about all of this, but I was thinking about the question of civilization, which came up a lot of times, and something that I keep going back to from the science symposium also is the relationship between civilization and knowledge. And I don't know if I've fully worked that out, but there definitely is a connection where, you know, a people's sort of way to know the world or make sense of the world and form human relationships on the basis of that knowledge has to be rooted in some ways in the civilizational values that define a people. And you see this everywhere. I feel like one of the reasons Gandhi was able to do what he was able to do was because he drew from that wellspring of ancient Indian civilization, but applied to a modern context. And then, even, you know, with the Black freedom movement, the rootedness in the Black church, in the, you know, in the gospel of freedom, so to speak. I think there's like, you know, it's always drawing on certain civilizational values. And I think the whole conversation about the social system, I do think it's actually related to the question of civilization because it's related to the question of how you see the world, how you make sense of the world, what is the basis of knowledge production, and the values or the civilization values you root yourself in can give rise to a certain social consciousness, but also a social system. And in general, like sort of the crisis of the white social system is related to the crisis of white civilization, which we discussed a lot in the science symposium. And sort of looking at this crisis in its totality also involves looking at the psychological impacts of that the white social system has on the people who subscribe to it, you know, which is what Baldwin really brings out. And in some ways, I also wanted to go back to something Michelle said about the student movement right now. What is the essence of it? What significance does it have? What does it say about this moment? I think it is also a response to the failures of the white social system to take this country or to take its people forward to where it needs to go together with world humanity. I mean, they're basically resisting a social system or a set of values that is compatible with war and that makes individuals and human beings compatible with human suffering.
yeah.
Um, so there is a certain psychosis that comes with the white social system also. And I think what you were saying about Israel makes that very concrete. You know, it's almost like madmen, you know, people acting in completely irrational ways while holding rationality as the way to, you know,
That's the idea.
as the ideal. But I don't know where I wanted to go with that.
Um, y'all correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm making any like too much generalizations. But I was also kind of thinking about this thing about maybe like a social system uh, giving or creating or giving like rise to civilization. I don't know if it's vice versa because you know the way I see a social system, it's like the institutions, the people, and the music, and everything like that produces, I guess, a people or what people produce, and also for a certain purpose. You know, I think Baldwin talks about the white social system or the white institutions as for a very, that they exist for like a very particular purpose, I guess, of having power, making money, and to some extent, there being like some irrationality there. But then to like the Black social system, something about a particular idea of freedom being that creates, I think, that social system.
Interesting.
Yeah, like coming out of a specific need or historical, the struggle against slavery. So that kind of creating a basis for people, for the church, for the art, music, and even sciences. And I'm just trying to figure out where I was gonna connect this to the world somehow. I forgot.
You there?
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could help. No, keep going. No, you keep going, Nathan. I got you.
No. This might take a question, because it also it comes to my mind for this thing about love, because I think that came out of a certain necessity too. It couldn't have just come out of nothing.
Right.
And I kind of see it as also like love is more of like well, it does have to relate to freedom, but also for one, having to negate like a sort of like not or anti-human like ideology on people. But I think Baldwin also says this a lot. Most clearly is has to do with a certain way of changing people, or a way of people being able to grow beyond
That's right.
their current conception of themselves and other people in the world. And so, I don't know how. It's because I thought about this like 2 hours ago or something, but it's been a lot. Just something about the creation of like a new. It had something to do when y'all are talking about. Was it the world theory or something? What was it called?
World social system.
Yeah, just like what a world social system could arise out of, because I think there's. Yeah, I mean, when Jerry first told me about this in the morning, my mind did like immediately go to like, oh, I guess economics or something, but that doesn't really fully explain everything, because I think like a world social system would also have to come out of like a certain need or something like, and you could see that being built, maybe even with this like, Tagore and China thing, with these type of basically, yeah, like I mean, I always kind of look at it as like, what do we want to build, and how does that inform like the steps that you take? And I guess like a new world social system having to do with civilization. I don't know how that, you can't say it would just be like one civilization or something like that, but it would have to be. I don't know, kind of like.
Wait, actually, the reason why that is something I was thinking about too is because the nature of the Black social system and what I was trying to explain, like, comes out of it. Meaning, like, the World House also is a question for, like, America in its becoming, like, that Black social system, or because I think that to ask it as a question of democracy, or like a fulfillment of democracy, how it would express itself in America is dependent on King, for one, but also now because of like, well, it's not also because of now, it's just something that is inherent in the Black freedom social system that is almost in a way inclusive of world civilization, which was another concept that I had about. But like in whether that be like an expression because of nonviolence or the discovery of it, or something inherent that
Can I ask a question? Because that relates to Nathan. Why did African Americans embrace
right,
Santagraya and Ahimsa?
right,
Close.
Yeah. How would you pronounce it?
Satyagraha.
Satyagraha.
Yeah.
Yes. Why did they? Why did they? What, I agree with you. What in the human situation of the African American people make it almost a human necessity to seek this out? Why? And I agree with you that I, it's something new in human history. It's a beautiful creation of in the modern world. It is a beautiful and it is generative, but it is not, it cannot become what it must become without the world. That's why Gandhi is so valuable. You know what I'm saying? I agree with you. And even the art, when Alice and John Coltrane or John Cherry or all of these, why did they go to India?
Yeah.
Why did they go to India? And I think, well, what if freedom is what they are striving for, then what, I agree with you, Sarah, how do they imagine freedom? And I'm telling you, they don't imagine it in the liberal bourgeois way. They do. It's almost as though they would sacrifice all that bourgeois society could give them. I'm not talking about that few opportunities, but the masses. They would sacrifice all of that for the beloved, to use that, the beloved community. If we could live free without yada yada, all of this, this would mean more than all the billions and all the yada 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 other things. If I could educate my children, if I, you know what I'm saying. And that's, I think that's where I agree with you, that the equation of the future and the imaginary of Black people has to be anchored to love. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to?
Well, I just wanted to maybe add on to this because I think when we are talking about freedom, personally for me, it clarifies the contradiction between the category of the individual and the category of the human being. I think it becomes clearest when you consider the question of freedom, because freedom for the individual means very different. It's a very different thing
Yes, it is.
than freedom for the human being, where freedom for the human being is the removal of all barriers, all restrictions on the full flowering of potential that every human being is comes in onto this earth with, and it also cannot be limited. If the human being is free, the human being is free everywhere. And that brings in the question. No, I mean, you don't get that kind of breadth with the category of the individual.
No.
The individual can be free to, say whatever, wear whatever, eat whatever, but the freedom of the human being is and that's the characteristic feature of the way Baldwin and King and Du Bois approach the world and approach the question of struggle. And the last thing I want to say, and sorry for taking up more time, but this is why I'm still thinking about this idea that the Du Bois Baldwin synthesis is important for this moment, particularly because they're obviously trying to do some very similar things, knowledge bent towards the project of human freedom, but then they also have their unique contributions to this question where Du Bois, I mean, the reason he writes
world and Africa, the reason he writes Russia and America, the reason he goes to China, you know, he's interested in the experiment. He's interested in the experiment in human democracy and freedom, and he contextualizes the Black struggle in, you know, in the whole scope of world revolutionary movements, you know. And then Baldwin, which we've already said, does something that's complementary but nobody else does, which is to talk about the psychological dimensions of, you know, American people, but then white people in particular, how trapped you become once you allow a certain value system to become defining of what kind of human being you're going to be. And in this moment, I feel like we're witnessing a crisis on both fronts, where on the world stage, you know, the way the world is moving, the way Asia is rising, it's difficult to fit America the way it operates right now in that picture. And then in the interior lives of Americans, there's also that crisis, which it's almost become untenable to go forward with the white social system. And the choice is you reject whiteness or you perish with a dying civilization. That's, you know, you have all of that coming together, perhaps most clearly for the first time in this moment. And anyway, all of that to say is that I'm trying to make sense of why it feels appropriate for this moment to attempt a synthesis of Baldwin and Du Bois.
Can I ask you a question? Because you used the word complementarity, which I think, you know, I know we use synthesis, but maybe we're talking about complementarity. I just put that.
Yeah. I don't know why I said it,
But I think it was useful. I think it might be more accurate.
because it's just like it's approaching
Not
different
this-
angles of the
That's
same
the
problem.
synthesis
Yeah.
comes out of a different process. Complementarity. Let's think of
Okay.
Right, like thesis, antithesis,
Yeah,
synthesis,
yeah.
but what if the negation?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like there is any inherent.
It might be more complementarity,
Just to get for a more complete.
which is a physics concept of not Heisenberg. Who's the complementarity principle?
Right.
Go think of that. Go ahead, shot two.
Oh yeah, I actually wanted to respond to Nathan because this is also something that I was thinking about during the time we were having a conversation, which is that does the social system come out of a civilization, or is there a possibility that a civilization can emerge out of a social system? And you know, I might be. I mean, this is what I think at the moment, which is that most, you know, Asian civilizations, India, China, I think the social system has emerged out of their civilization. But I think that in America, which is an extension of the European white civilization, there is a very unique opportunity for this, for America itself. Well, America is not a civilization yet. And I think it has a unique opportunity to become a civilization from the Black social system, emerging from the Black social system, if we were to actually achieve this, dethrone of the white supremacist social system, and in place of it, the viable alternative would be the Black social system. If we were to accept that and find a way to, you know, merge love and, this kind of egalitarianism, which is not like in the European sense. I think that we can become, America itself can become a civilization separate from Europe, which delinks it from whiteness and white civilization and links it with the rest of the world. America has the possibility of becoming a civilization. This is how I was thinking about it. It would be the first civilization to emerge out of a social system based on a freedom movement.
Yeah. This is okay. I'm sorry.
I think that's what I was thinking about that when I thought of Nathan's question. The other thing is that
Before you get to the other thing, yes, this is very, very important. In this sense, there is very little comparison of China and India with the United States.
Yeah.
it is a civilization in potentiality, whereas these long civilizations with histories, and by the way, I just wanted to say, history, the word history, the use history, the concept history is very unwieldy. It is more often a default to something that we don't know, that we don't really care to know what we're defaulting to. So we use history, blame it on history, assign it to history. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know why I'm saying, but I'm just a little, and the same with the word civilization,
Right.
unless we are connecting it concretely to what India, Chinese civilization, and even then, we have to be very careful in how it's deployed. I mean, of course, that's why, I guess that's why I was more focused upon social systems and not talking history or civilization as something. But we have to talk it, but we have to be careful. Okay. I'm sorry, Shanta, I cut you off.
That was
Oh.
informative.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I had a very
No, let Shanta
Okay.
finish, then Crystal, then Eddie.
I think that I'll be quick. I think that one of the things
Take your time.
that really struck me was, when we were talking about how, the current leftist movement, goes at everything from the point of view of economics. You establish an economic, you sort of reiterate the economic theory that's been around for ages, and using that to try to explain ideology, try to explain the human. But we have seen that in the Du Bois Baldwin synthesis, which is something that I really do think is the way forward. Like, more I think about it, there is a dialectical relationship. Whereas, Du Bois understood the human through society and a sociological study of it. Baldwin comes at it from a more human perspective and understands society. So I think that they complement each other, they coexist, where there is a bidirectionality which can be established. Whereas when you see, classical Marxism, you can't establish this bidirectionality.
What does bidirectionality mean if you don't?
Goes both ways.
It goes both ways.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, that's, yeah, but I'm still thinking about it. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris.
So I just wanted to ask, I feel like I'm confused by how we're using certain terms like civilization, white civilization, American civilization, American people, and social system. And I think I agree that, well, I think it is possible, or there is this relationship where a social system can produce a civilization, but also a civilization can produce a social system. And well, I feel like if you take the people in this room, for example, would you consider me part of Chinese civilization within the white social system, trying to
Break free of.
to break free of it by going to the black social system, or the Taiwanese as the Taiwanese, but adopting the white social system, and the trajectory of that is that they become part of white civilization. I just want to clarify. I'm confused.
I hear you. Go. Wait, hold. But let's address. I don't think we should let this pass. Because I think you're right, Chris, that we have to be clear about what we're talking about, and not throw everything into the pot at the same time. But let me ask you this. Do you understand what we mean when we talk about a social system?
I think so.
More or less, yeah. Is it clear what we mean when we talk about a white supremacist social system. And, okay. And, okay, so yeah. Now, that's why the thing of civilization, I was always, just hold back for a minute, because that's a whole different thing. And I agree with you here. It might not be applicable to this moment of crisis in the American system. I mean, we can see and we can say there is if we define it like this, a crisis of the white supremacist social system, then we see the possibilities of freedom from that system. That system in crisis offers opportunities, and yada, yada, yada. Go.
Can I add one thing? Well, I feel like I'm trying to decipher which one would make the most sense based upon which one puts the moral choice as the central
Which one does what?
Which one puts the moral choice as a central question, or which one puts love as the basis? Like which one accounts for love, which one accounts for music?
And when the which ones, what are the two which ones?
Well, I think that. Well, I don't feel like I have this worked out, but I feel like my instinct is that one, understanding it as a social system or understanding it as a civilization, one actually factors in the moral choice, while the other doesn't.
See, I hear this, and this is relevant to our discussion of the Chinese social system and the Chinese in America, who might be from Chinese civilization, but is entangled in the white supremacist social system. There is no Chinese system in America. So, and this, either the Chinese accept their status or positioning in the white supremacist social system, or they reject it and adopt the values and norms of the alternative, which is the Black social system. And that becomes the question of the human being, because the Chinese human being, and this, I get this from Kathy, from Alice, from everybody, that yes, I am from China. I'm not in China. You know what I'm saying? And so then that's a moral choice then. It is so obvious. It became more obvious for me knowing Chinese people what the moral choice, either the white supremacist system, which can give certain benefits, opportunities, material well-being, six figures and all of that, but at the cost of one's humanity. And but go ahead.
Well, I actually think that's I think that's also why these past weeks where we've basically brought up the concept of a social system it's almost really freeing. It puts a language even to I feel our personal lives in a way. Because the reason why social system is such a useful definition is or even just a useful concept, and why it's almost really relieving, in an emotional sense, is because actually, even when for example, there will never be a Chinese social system, right?
I don't think so.
There's two social systems, and in some ways it puts words to something we all feel, something we.
Can I ask a question? Just, if you don't mind, if there will never be a Chinese social system, is that a fair assertion?
Yeah.
I'm asking the Chinese.
Taiwanese.
Then I ask the Taiwanese. But there will never be a Chinese social system, which means then that as Chinese, you will gradually become white and individuals.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, because that's right.
And that is a hell of a prospect. If that's all you have to strive for,
right?
It's okay.
Well, it's also why, for example, I think this was Nana who brought it up, which is in America, if you let's say you're from a Chinese family or an Indian family, whatever family, Mexican family, any family that's non-white and also non-Black, for example, it doesn't matter that it doesn't matter how much you try to keep your quote unquote traditions, culture, you create a Chinatown or whatever town, you're basically allowing yourself to be part of white. You are essentially, by not seeing even the Black social system, you are allowing yourselves to be captured into a white social system.
Yeah.
And it's Baldwin who said that is actually a moral and political choice.
Yeah.
Right.
And but the reason why I kind of gave a certain language is because I remember you're always like, oh, why did you guys like from Cornell come to, like, why basically did you trust me when I came to Cornell? And actually, I think it's because at a certain point, and maybe this is the moral choice, at a certain point you realize that there's only one system. There's only one system, one future, and that is the Black social system, which is less and does not really have to do with simply skin or race as whatever concept. It has to do with a worldview. It has to do with the whole system of many different things, values, all of that. And yeah, because that's also what I was trying to get at with the Black freedom movement. I think I misunderstood the civil rights movement as a like a removal of color, like making it, like there's no, it lowers the barrier or the existence of systems. When actually that's not true. I think actually in fact what you saw in this great revolution, Third American Revolution, is you saw you've seen overwhelming number of white people, so-called white people, doing something weird, which is abdicating a social system because they have decided there's only one social system I want to be a part of. Like, right, what's the choice, which is like the moral choice. You see a lot of white people from the North moving south. Like, they're saying, actually, by sacrificing something, I can become more complete. Like, it's exactly by sacrificing something that I can become more
Even my life.
Even my life. Yeah, and so that's actually, and then the second thing the Black freedom movement does.
Can I just say one thing? You take Viola Liuzzo or James Reed.
Right.
By giving up my life, I acknowledge that there is a future beyond whiteness.
Yes.
We have to talk about that.
Well, okay, the last thing I'll throw in, which is that Baldwin has this concept where he says there will never be white leadership. He actually says we should not be striving for there to be leaders of the white community because there is no white community. And I feel like in some ways what he's essentially saying is that leadership is not white leadership, white people. Leadership is white people choosing the Black social system. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you helped get to my point when you articulated first that there exists two social systems, and wherever your background is, you either choose to be white, which you could do it in your ethnic garb, and you're even if you're only in communion with people that look like you, you don't even have to speak English to live in whiteness in this country. It's crazy, and so I'm trying to. So I'm trying to ask myself, how can I relate to the Black social system? I'm trying to get down with that. I'm trying to get down with freedom, and and what you said about choosing Black leadership, I saw the civil rights movement after your analysis as a way to confront the white social system, and in some ways it had some success, right? Because you remove barriers of contact, and you could have white and Black and all be together. And the goal, I guess, of having a Black social system right now to me is like you can become part of a social system that is not here to try to move up in society, but overcome oppression in this society, namely white supremacy. And I'm trying to get a sense of like, is it just that simple that like you be around Black people, or even because, like, for example, I'm trying to get down with the Nation of Islam, man. Hell yeah, that's where I like to be. I would like to send my kids to Muhammad University of Islam. I don't want to send them to just any public school. But
I told you, man. I keep telling. Go ahead.
But in part of making a Black social system, once again, it's not something that I directly emerged out of, right? My parents did not emerge from slavery in this country, to like oppression, and I'm trying to become part of this like social system, trying to, and I want everyone, like myself or not, to be able to like be a part of it, and at least what I got out of the civil rights movement is that in lowering the barriers of contact, and then challenging the primary contradictions in society, you could work out a new relationship between different people, which at a certain point were at odds with each other. Because if you're in the white social system, you know, you're trying to, at the very least, get away from Black people and usually be above them. And so in making a black social system, does this mean you have like new institutions of different kinds of people? Like, obviously, a lot is, you know, going for me. A lot is going for me. Going to Moss is doing a lot for me, right? But like, what would it look like for like a whole people to live differently under a different social system? And I think part of it is a theoretical question, but I think a lot of it does have to get resolved in practice through struggle. You have a new relationship and you have a new system. But I have more questions than answers.
But I feel you completely, Eddie. And, when we talk, I think, and, we're all talking about this alternative social system in different ways. For example, Emily and Chris will talk about it in one way, Michelle and certainly Purba and Shantanu. But one thing we all agree upon, and it's almost a concrete universal for us, that this alternative to the white supremacist social system exists in many and varied forms already. It is only a matter of its being acknowledged and being embraced. And you have said, and many others, Minister Abel, which is because it then produces out of the Mexican immigrant experience a different kind of human being than the trajectory would look like without it. And that's what I'm talking to. Minister Abel is such a revelation, not just for you, but for me. The way he lives, the values that he lives upon. And you're right. Or take Eileen X. Muhammad, my girl. The same thing if when I follow her on Facebook. This is not the human being that the white world would have predicted for you, Eddie. No way in the world. No, and this is something so beautiful, which makes even more concrete and relevant the concept of a Black social system coming out of, like you said, Nick, the necessity of the struggle for freedom. There would have been no need for it without slavery, without unfreedom. And it would not have to exist up till today if we were free. There is a nation of Islam, which is now, becoming a world house, if you will. You all are making it into a world house here in Philadelphia. Nobody would have predicted. I asked Jerome, I asked Michael and them, would you have ever predicted? They said no. We thought we would always be a Black movement and yada, yada, yada. We didn't know that our appeal could be. Talk to you. Okay.
Don't stop, please. I want to hear.
Okay. It was unpredicted. But I think, I'm talking about the crisis of the white supremacist social system, where how could you feed into it when it can't even provide for white people what it promised them. I think this is, I mean, when you think about the beauty of this, it can only be captured really by the poets and musicians.
Yes. Wait, can I say?
Oh, good. I'm sorry.
I just want to make one minor comment, which is that, I feel like we're trying to also, like Emily was saying, find the language to talk about this. But I instinctively, without too much basis to this, I instinctively feel that the civilizational category cannot be given up on, simply because, when we talked about, say, Palestine and Gaza, and seeing that war as a war in defense of the supremacy of white civilization, I think that formulation has something to offer to understand the crisis and to understand the world situation today. That I don't know. I mean, would you say that the social system could perform a similar function in that context?
Well, I think there's several things going on here. One, where we talked about every state is a civilization state, and every modern war is a civilization war. You know what I'm saying? Now, and that when we talk about the white man, we're talking about a civilization. Now, the question is that perhaps, for the first time, we will see the undoing of a civilization. And its only future is to the extent that other civilizations and emerging civilizations are prepared to embrace the best of it to serve the future. So now, how that plays into Indian civilization, there's a whole different thing,
Would you say it's the end of a civilization and birth of a new one?
Yeah. But see, the thing is, and this is where Xi Jinping and his ideas are so valuable, I think. Like Kathy talks about, Sun Xing Ling said, well, Confucius was conservative. There's no value for it as we go forward to build this new revolutionary civilization. And then Xi Jinping says that, well, we're going to set up Confucian centers all over the world and teach Chinese and Chinese civilization using Confucius. Well, that is something they will have to work out. How it will be worked out in India is a different thing. But one thing is for certain, we are not bound in this country by, well, put it this way, civilization. Therefore, we can think and imagine a new revolutionary civilization, a civilization that emerges not in the past, and does not have a history. Certainly, yeah. And so it is the potential of a civilization based upon revolutionary ideas. This is and revolutionary music. And so a civilization which in many ways is new. I agree with what Nanditha said about this first, or I would put it a little different way, in the vanguard of colored modernity. I think that's the way Robeson would have thought of it too. But this idea of the Enlightenment and European civilization having produced the key, but does not have the strength to use it. And so that's along the lines of what Du Bois said, the collapse of Europe. Cannot use what they themselves, well, not all of it, but a lot of what they produced, cannot use it. And so, okay, that's all.
Could I say?
Yeah, go.
One of the important things you were talking about in the beginning about injustice system. There's a term we call structural injustice. Structural injustice that you were leading to. And you can think of a person
work all the time. You know, he can be a good person, and he can in fact be live an unhappy life and work, you know, work do all the right things. But the structure of the system and what you're talking about is changing that structure. That's where the revolution comes about. Changing economics, the whole system. And that's very important. I think that's what you.
Well, no, that we're talking about more than that. But see, but Dwight, you had to be here early on. Yeah, but see, we were saying that is with okay, but no. See, we are talking about. Well, maybe they can tell. It's something more. We're not talking in Enlightenment or Marxist terms. We're really not. And we're saying that to identify the crisis right now in the United States, the Marxian analysis is inadequate.
Oh, yes, of course. I mean,
but I think you had presented basically a Marxist analysis.
No, I'm not saying it's Marx. No, leaving that out. I'm saying that is more than that. And I'm agreeing with you. That is more than that. I'm agreeing with you. I'm not saying, but I'm actually saying that it is a structure plus more. Spiritual, social identity. You know, you were talking about, for example, Kristen was talking about identity. You know, we're more than just identify as we are phenotypical. You know, we're human beings. We have certain common needs, and we have to find the common ground instead of being tribal. We're very tribal in the way we think, you know, and so we have to find that common ground, that humanity in all of us. And that brings out all the things that Seraphine talked about, love and all of that. Yeah. I think that's very important. And you guys are a reflection of the change in society. When you talked about America is changing. And we can represent the difference because look at the table. This is not 1950. This is different. You are the actual concrete representation of change.
Yeah.
That's the way I see it.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Samir, and then.
I mean, to sort of resolve sort of Dwight's language. I mean, it's hard because we're doing something new. Like you said, there's nothing previous for us to build on when me and Eddie go to the Nation of Islam. There's no language we can draw from. And so what we're talking about, you know, I was thinking about the very beginning where we were talking about, like, we're not talking about economics, we're talking about the totality of the crisis that affects the society in its totality. So that's why we're talking about a social system, and why, you know, I thought about the idea of the avant-garde, whether it's art or if it's art journal. But I was kind of thinking of the concept of revolution of values, and while we're studying Baldwin, because of, you know, as many of us have said and explored, that Baldwin has a different measuring stick for a man. That Baldwin leads to a different morality, different values. And I was also thinking about, you know, we're talking about Nation of Islam. I was also thinking about Eastern Islam, where, you know, after 3 generations, you know, the Islamic Empire, the Golden Caliphate collapses, and connecting to things with sloppy. I was connecting what Purba said about civilization and knowledge. When the Quran was presented to the Prophet Muhammad, the Quran says the angel Gabriel told him to read. And that's very important for Muslims because there's something about Islam and language and knowledge and reading and studying. And so when Islamic civilization collapsed, it was the Persians who inherited Islamic civilization. It wasn't theirs, but they inherited the Arabic language. And some of the most talented Arabic poets were Persians. And
Arabic. In Arabic.
And Turks. And so we could all say that was all part of Islamic civilization. But it reminded me of how Western civilization doesn't have the strength to turn the key, or how we talked about how Western civilization is exhausted and can no longer proceed forward. And it reminds me of how the Persians must have felt to say, okay, this isn't ours, it doesn't originate from us, but we have to continue this, we have to continue studying Arabic. We have to continue this civilization. And the idea that to what you were saying, Dwight, Islam came to a very tribalistic society. I mean, in the original sense, where everybody is related to each other. They still have tribes today, in Jordan and whatnot. They still meet, and your tribe is important. But Islam came about and said, no, every man, every woman is your brother and sister, and that's a revolution of values. And so we're not trying to just. I think there are too many people who are stuck in an economic mode. That we need economic change. That's why you began with Richard Wolff, who essentially says, "Oh, we just need co-ops." Or I've been talking to Todd a lot about Todd Doherty, about so-called Marxist Leninists who say that the Saturday Priest. He said this morning. Sorry, Todd. He said this morning that there are Marxist Leninists who follow Midwestern Marx, who say that the Saturday Preschool, they talk about race because they can't grasp the material reality.
Keep talking. This is very enjoyable.
Yeah, no, I thought navigating dots. I thought this was the response, but I guess this is the preemptive strike. Preemptive strike against the economic productiveness. We're talking about a crisis of totality, theory of crisis, and that includes religion, that includes art, that includes.
My comment about AI, right?
Yeah. I think I'll go.
Just a brief. One of the criticisms of the Saturday Free School is that we talk about race because we can't grasp the material reality. I mean, they actually say that.
I'll ask Todd.
No, but it's very interesting.
It is interesting because I was telling Todd about another country,
Yeah.
and I don't want to spoil it for him because I'm anti-spoilers. But I was so we're here. I guess Blazing Biscuit here. But when we finished another country, Baldwin was really talking about time and reality, and how another country is about a group of friends who lose a friend to suicide, and how they deal with it. And when Vivaldo is able to learn to love Rufus's sister, he first has to learn to love Rufus, and afterwards, only then is he able to see reality for what it is, and only then is he able to complete his novel. And that's what Baldwin says. And I don't understand that. I still need to think about that. But I was thinking about that reaction to the economic reality.
Go ahead, Jerry.
I think, I don't know if this is also right either, but partially in response to the discussion about civilization, I think, because like Baldwin has this, I think it's in his essay, Black English isn't a language, tell me what it is. Or it might be another later essay where he says, Black people in America are the only possible bridge between the West past and its possible future. I think that's also another way of saying, is in America that the fate of Western civilization will be determined.
Yes, last week.
Yeah.
And whether, and like, even aside from the question of America as like a civilization and potentiality, I think that also clarifies the urgency of the question of the white supremacist social system. And I think I also, responding to Eddie's question earlier, I think part of what I heard, Eddie, what you were asking was like, it's like how do we make concrete the revolutionary essence of what we're talking about when we say like, oh, white people or just all Americans becoming part of the Black social system? How do we actually clarify that that's a revolutionary position and not just a question of personal preference? Because I think what?
You made it sound so good.
Well, because I think part of what the difficulty that you run up against in American society is like, oh, like everyone just has the right to move out of their And I think people can also relate to free school in that way, where they're also saying, oh, like those people just like prefer to live that way. You know, and yeah, like it's like a personal preference thing. Oh, I just like Black music. I just like
And they're
and
all
I think that I think that's a very American way of understanding it, but I think that's a very dangerous way of interpreting what free school is doing. But I think that part of what is our task is how do we present the moral choice like we've been talking about, but how do you present it as something which is unavoidable? That all Americans have to face this one way or another. You can choose however you want to, but you can't avoid that question. And our task is how do we actually present it in such a way where it's like, oh, like you have to face this. Because I think that's part of what the civil rights movement did. It made the question of segregation, of Jim Crow, and of basically whiteness, it made it an unavoidable question across the entire country. And I feel like we, in our own experimental ways, are trying to do that in the city of Philadelphia. But I feel like that's part of what I feel like it's like distinguishing just between the question of like this whole American attitude of like, oh, that's just your personal preference versus an actual revolutionary position. And I think that's also where the last thing I wanted to say was I was thinking about like also like the reading groups, your Baldwin, literacy campaign, and similar to like what you said last week about Lawson, where part of Lawson's interpretation of the Cuban Revolution, for instance, as a nonviolent revolution through basically through the lens of like the literacy campaign that Cuba did, is that we are also doing in our reading groups through the literacy campaign. This is also our way of practicing nonviolence. And I feel like we have to. I don't know. I just feel like that needs to be said. It's like this is what we're undertaking is not such something which is like nice. It's not just like a nice thing of people reading Baldwin together. And it's also I think this is really important in this moment because part of how I think to be honest, I think a lot of white people and a lot of Americans are reacting to the way that the ruling class is clamping down on like the protesters, for instance, and especially around this question of Zionism, is that the default is always like, oh, like why can't we just have civil discourse in America again, right? And that this attitude is like, oh, like I just wish that we could go back to that time when people could talk, they could have opinions, and they could disagree, and like that's America. And I feel like that's basically the liberal democratic idea of essentially, like what is democracy basically. And I think that like what we are pushing for is something beyond that. And that's also what is part of the revolutionary essence of the reading groups and the literacy campaign, where it's not just, like you guys were saying, it's not just a place where people come together, talk about their opinions, disagree, and like that's the end of the story. That's not democratic, that's also not revolutionary. And I feel like part of what we're pushing for is not just this thing of like, oh, like we're dogmatically telling people what to do, but like people have to enter into some kind of process in which they transform as human beings. And it's not just this like blasé thing at the end of the day. Like, oh yeah, I just said my opinion and like that's it. And yeah, I just feel like I was just vibing with what Eddie was saying. Where it's like we have to present it in a way where it's not just like a full thing of like personal preference, which is also part of the question of the individual, but it actually has to be presented in such a way where it's like whether you choose how you want to respond to it. Like that's your choice. That's also the question of you being an adult. But it's at the end of the day, it's like we're presenting a question before people, which is like you can't avoid it. You have to answer in some way or another. And that's also like I feel like that's like kind of the revolutionary fire of Baldwin. It's like you can avoid it. When you can delude yourself into thinking you're avoiding it, but you actually can't. And I think yeah, I don't know. I just feel like that revolutionary
And
essence.
especially in this moment of crisis.
Right.
And what, and that, you know, Boss,
Yeah.
this is not just talk any longer,
Right.
you know?
I just want to, again, talking about the student movement, I feel like the reason why the student movement has a quality or a revolutionary consciousness that it has not been able to achieve in this country is also because these choices are becoming clearer than they ever were. So now they know it's not a matter of preference whether you support Palestine. It's the moral choice, and where you stand, on which side you stand, determines, you know, what your future or what, you know, yeah. But yeah. Also,
Maybe we have some comments.
Oh, yeah.
It-
Lots of-
This place fits free school so beautifully that we don't want to leave.
Yes, I think that's what you're right. Do I make comments?
Yeah, Todd, Nuri, M. Sparks, someone named Dinner with Franklin, Barco all said good morning. Nuri said, wow, loving the new setup and location. Shimbarto said, good morning, everyone, beautiful new location at the church. Then someone with a Chinese username, you know what that is?
No.
Said, the Taiping Rebellion was likely a Western instigation in preparation of the U.S. Losing the institution of slavery. And then M. Sparks said, yeah, that basically the Israelis are super white and they're Jewish in name only. And then the person with the Chinese username said, I don't know who that's referring to. Someone started reading Christian pamphlets and adopting vague ideas and studied under an American Baptist preacher before converting to Protestantism.
Yeah, the Taipei, yeah.
Oh,
But it became more than that, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
okay. And then adds, disrupting social restrictions can still fall short of demolishing a civilization. I feel like people are just engaging with like also like this thing with like what we were talking about with like social system versus civilization, what's the relationship between them? And then that superiority demands creating victims. So like white superiority demands that you create victims in order to justify that superiority. Then Amiri says, wow, loving this discussion of love and nonviolence, transforming human beings is at the vanguard of a new theory. And I could not agree with Serafina more about Baldwin's novel Just Above My Head, specifically the character of Arthur when he reflects on his brother's attempts to fit into a white supremacist social system, saying, quote, nobody is happy. I wonder what goes on behind all these shutters. It can't be nothing, but it sure doesn't seem to be something. And then Arthur's brother says, quote, we just want to be free, to which Arthur laughs at the absurdity, and their dialectic around freedom provides creative contribution that must be developed in the 21st century and beyond. The science conference, especially given the ecological crisis of the planet due to war and profit, has me meditating on how civilizational values from darker peoples anchor us in new possibilities, thus freeing people from rationality/individuality and unlocking their collective scientific artistic potential. The world born of this would be compatible with a Black social system, but it is an existential threat to the white social system. As y'all are saying, there is a future which won't be recognizable to those who cling to crumbling lies instead of embracing hard truth and hard work. And then someone's username, Afropolis, said, greetings from Athens. I had the pleasure of coming to see you when I was in Philly.
Oh, that's, yeah.
I don't know who that was.
I think that's Pete Timor.
Oh.
Yeah.
And then the person with the Chinese username says, the basis of a civilization is a city, and the fundament of a social system is an interpersonal relationship. And then Reverend Ike Miller says, just now figuring out that chat is possible. Working on the system and has stumbled upon Free School Live on YouTube.
Say that again.
He said he's working on a sermon right now.
Yeah.
And he just now stumbled upon our Free School live stream on YouTube. He said, I can't keep up with you guys, but thank you nonetheless. I catch the whole session from your archives. So he watches it afterwards. And then Amiri says, yes, Doc. the new civilization based upon a loving social system will be futuristic and cannot be fully articulated by anything other than revolutionary ideas, art, and science emerging from this time, a loving, peaceful, and free social system. And then username Fired Play says, what Lawson is saying is wrong. The Cuban Revolution was both armed and unarmed factions working together. And I feel like it's less about like the armed nature of like what is typically known as the Cuban Revolution, but Lawson's point was that it's like what the Cuban Revolutionary did to transform Cuban society into uplift, especially the Cuban peasantry, and basically basically transform social relations. That to Lawson was kind of the essence of nonviolence at work. After basically the achievement of some power through arms struggle. Because Lawson also wasn't really even that opposed to like armed struggle in that sense. Because he admired both like, the Cuban Revolution and the Vietnamese Revolution. And then Don DeBar says, greetings from Austin, New York.
Can I respond to the Lawson is wrong? Oh, like when we talked about the Russian Revolution, I remember in the year of Gandhi, you talked about the Russian Revolution and reinterpreted it as, the state was already in a crisis, the Russian state, indebted and in war, and it was the Russian army that stood down that allowed the revolution. And basically, the state collapsed, and the Bolsheviks walked into power. And
because in the Cuban case, pretty much like Batista was like, I think this is not going to work out for me. He just got on a train and left, and then Fidel and his comrades were able to just walk into Havana with the open arms of people cheering him like, come in, this is what we want. So it's like a similar thing, and also like it's like I think I agree like the transformation of it did not come from the to respond with that phrasing like it didn't. Like, that's why we're so interested in the literacy campaign.
Yeah, that's part of the contradiction of this time. Because it's not only what we want, sometimes it's what is imposed upon us. And in every case, it's not that Ho Chi Minh wanted to fight a war against the French and the Americans. Not that even Mao, who proclaimed power comes from a barrel of gun, they would have preferred nonviolence. I think this is what Eddie and I know Samir was saying last week, and it was very impressive to me that even by withdrawing from an unjust system and creating your own, that is an act of nonviolent resistance. I agree with that very, very much. So there is in humanity a default to nonviolence. The ruling classes' option in the face of change is violence, and as we see in Gaza.
And something that helped me understood, things like the Vietnam War or violent uprising was what Scott Ritter said, or the Russian operation. Scott Ritter said, war doesn't solve all problems, but it does solve some problems. And, I think
he's a Marine.
He's a Marine. So that's his move. But
does wars? That's a good question, though.
Does war solve problems?
Yeah, does war solve any of the human problems? I mean, we can think about it. It's hard to make a judgment. But one thing we can say that all things considered, in our situation, the crisis of this, there is a nonviolent resistance path to freedom. And I think that's what Lawson pronounced when he was here in Philadelphia when we spoke with him. And we cannot, I think this is the option that is before us. And I agree with you, Jerry, that if we can be successful in creating this knowledge framework, and this is why the reading of Baldwin throughout Philadelphia is so very important. It is, it really is, because it raises all of these questions that we're discussing for the American people. I know a lot of American radicals always want to talk about everybody else and every other country and every other revolution, but when it comes here, they become tongue-tied.
That was a good ending point.
Yes.
We officially have reached thought.
Seems only like two.
Really?
It's so comfortable. We really have to thank Madre.
Yeah.
This is.
Yeah.
Church facilitates thought.
Yes.
The church facilitates thought.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why the science conference was such a high level. Yeah, because we're at this church.
I agree. Well, are we?
And we had flowers.
And we had flowers at the dog's garden. Okay, we're gonna end the live. Bye, everyone. See you next time.